There is something deeply strange living underneath the surface of Pokémon. Not the kind of strange you notice right away. Not the loud, obvious kind. This is the quiet kind. The kind that creeps up on you somewhere between the second and third hour of a late-night playthrough, when the music is doing something funny in the background, and you start to wonder whether you've actually thought about what any of this means. Pokémon has been with us for 30 years now. It started in 1996 as a pair of games on a gray cartridge in a gray handheld that made sounds like a tin can full of coins being dropped down a staircase, and it grew into something so enormous that it became, by some counts, the highest-grossing media franchise in the history of human civilization. More than Star Wars. More than the entire Marvel catalog. More than Hello Kitty. Pokémon. And in all that time, across all those games and seasons and cards and movies and trading cards and spin-offs and reboots and remakes, the fans have been watching carefully, obsessively, lovingly. They've been picking apart every line of dialogue, every unused piece of code, every Pokédex entry that felt a little too dark for a children's game, every background detail in an episode that aired once on a Saturday morning in 1999 and never again. What they found was extraordinary. A world that is not quite what it seems on the surface. A world with ghosts in its architecture, shadows in its mythology, and secrets buried so far down in the cartridge data that they were never meant to be found at all. Tonight we are going to go through all of it. Every major theory, every piece of evidence, every corner where something doesn't quite add up, and the fandom has spent 2 decades trying to figure out why. This is not a list. This is a journey. We're going to take it slowly. We're going to take it gently, and by the time we reach the end, you'll either be fast asleep or staring at your ceiling with very new thoughts about a game you thought you knew. Get comfortable, let's begin. Section 1. The Ghost in the Music Lavender Town and the Syndrome That Wasn't. Before we say anything else, let's set the scene. You are 10 years old. It is 1996. You are playing Pokémon Red or Pokémon Green. This is Japan, so it's green. The version that never made it to the West in that form. You've been playing for hours. You've collected your starter, you've fought your way through the early gyms, you've experienced the particular joy of catching a Pokémon you've never seen before and watching its little sprite bob in the box. The game has been cheerful. The music has been cheerful. Pallet Town's theme is the musical equivalent of a warm morning. Pewter City's theme has that determined march to it. Everything feels adventurous and bright and clean. And then you arrive in Lavender Town. The music changes. It is nothing like what came before. Where the other town themes feel like movement, like going somewhere, the Lavender Town theme feels like arriving somewhere you shouldn't be. It has a very specific quality, a thin, high, cycling melody that sits just at the edge of unsettling. It doesn't resolve cleanly. It loops around itself without ever really landing anywhere comfortable. The tower at the center of town is a cemetery for dead Pokémon, and the music knows it. Even as a child, you feel something slightly wrong about the place. You want to pass through quickly. You want to do what you need to do and get out. This is where the legend begins. The Lavender Town Syndrome, also known as the Lavender Town Tone, and in the more dramatic corners of the internet as the Lavender Town Suicides, is a creepypasta that emerged in the early years of internet fandom and became one of the most widely circulated pieces of gaming mythology ever written. The story, in its most commonly repeated form, claims the following. Shortly after the Japanese release of Pokémon Red and Green on the 27th of February, 1996, there was a spike in illness and self-harm among Japanese children between the ages of 7 and 12. The spike was allegedly concentrated among children who had reached Lavender Town in the game. The cause, according to the legend, was the Lavender Town theme music itself, which contained extremely high-frequency tones, frequencies that, according to the story, are only audible to children whose ears have not yet fully developed to the level of an adult's. The numbers attached to the story grew over time, as internet legends tend to do. Some versions of the tale claimed that approximately 200 children died. Others pushed the number higher. The children who did not harm themselves were said to have complained of severe headaches, nausea, and irrational behavior, all triggered, specifically, after the game's music played through those crucial opening bars of the Lavender Town theme. The story claimed that after these incidents, Game Freak went back into the code, lowered the frequency of the problematic tones, and released a revised version of the music. This is why, the legend states, The Lavender Town music sounds slightly different in the international releases of Pokémon Red and Blue compared to the original Japanese version. The change was real. The music was altered, and for people who wanted to believe the story, that alteration was the smoking gun. It's a beautifully constructed piece of fiction. Let's sit with it a moment before we pull it apart. Because the reason the Lavender Town syndrome worked, the reason it spread so far and so fast, and lodged itself so firmly in the collective memory of an entire generation of Pokémon fans, is that it understood something true about the game. Lavender Town actually is unsettling, not in a harmful way, not in a dangerous way, but in the way that good horror understands how to unsettle you, the way that a single wrong note in an otherwise pleasant piece of music can make your skin prickle. The designers at Game Freak did something genuinely smart with Lavender Town. In a game that was otherwise cheerful and accessible, they created a location that felt genuinely heavy. The Pokémon Tower is a place where dead Pokémon are buried. The ghost encounters in the tower, before you get the Sylph Scope, are actual unknown horrors. The game won't even tell you what you're fighting. They're just listed as ghost. You can't run. You can barely survive. There is a Marowak there, a mother who was killed by Team Rocket while protecting her baby Cubone, and her spirit cannot rest. She attacks you not out of malice but out of grief and unresolved pain. And when you defeat her, she finally goes still. And the story never dwells on it, never gives it a dramatic moment, never lets you process what just happened before you're already climbing the next floor. That is disturbing. That is genuinely disturbing. And it was designed for children. So when a story came along that said, yes, this place is more than just atmospherically dark, this place actually contains something harmful baked into its code, it resonated. It connected with the memory of having felt something wrong in that town that you couldn't quite explain. The technical claims of the legend, however, fall apart quickly under examination. The most fundamental problem is biological. The human ear's sensitivity to high-frequency sound does change with age. Children can typically hear higher frequencies than adults, a fact that has been used to create products like the Mosquito, a device designed to repel teenagers from public spaces by emitting a tone that older people cannot perceive. So the premise, in isolation, is not entirely made up. But the Game Boy's audio hardware simply cannot produce the frequencies the legend describes. The original Game Boy used a custom sound chip capable of generating 4 simultaneous audio channels. Its frequency range was constrained by the limits of 8-bit hardware in 1989. The high-frequency tones described in the legend tones, specifically pitched to affect children's hearing in the ways described, could not have been generated by that hardware. The Game Boy speaker is a small, low-quality component designed for basic sound reproduction. It is not capable of producing ultrasonic or near-ultrasonic frequencies at meaningful volume. Additionally, no contemporaneous evidence of the alleged events has ever surfaced. There are no newspaper articles from 1,996 reporting mass illness among children who played Pokémon. There are no hospital records. There are no statements from Game Freak or Nintendo addressing any such crisis. Given that Pokémon became one of the most commercially successful products in Japanese history during that same period, any kind of genuine tragedy of the scale described in the legend would have been a catastrophic public relations event. It would have ended the franchise before it began. The Lavender Town Syndrome, as Wikipedia and numerous researchers have confirmed, is a fabricated internet legend, a creepypasta that went viral in the early days of online Pokémon fandom, gained additional details through years of community elaboration, and was eventually presented as fact by people who were either very young, very credulous, or very good at writing convincingly. The Leave Now image allegedly found encoded in the music's spectrogram was a manipulated image added to make the story more compelling. The photos of unknown characters visible in audio visualization software were faked. The Bulbapedia talk pages documenting real fans debating whether the story was factual are a window into a community genuinely wrestling with whether something terrible had happened. But here's where it gets interesting. Here's where it stops being just a debunking exercise and becomes something more strange. The music was changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that suggests panic or a cover-up. But the Japanese version of the Lavender Town theme and the international version are measurably different compositions. The international version has fewer and simpler high-frequency tones. The tempo is slightly different. Some of the more dissonant intervals were smoothed out. Game Freak, when localizing the game for international audiences, made specific, deliberate alterations to that particular piece of music. Why? The most prosaic explanation, and almost certainly the correct one, is that this was simply localization. Game Freak altered sound effects and music throughout the game for various reasons as they prepared the international release. The original Japanese soundtrack was rebuilt using different audio tools, and some pieces came out sounding slightly different as a result. There may have been concerns about the Game Boy's speaker performance in certain markets. There may have been simple artistic revision. The Lavender Town theme being changed does not require a sinister explanation. But the internet does not prefer prosaic explanations. And so the fact of the change became the seed of the legend. And the legend grew, and it has never quite died, because something about it keeps feeling right even when you know it's wrong. What Lavender Town Syndrome really is, at its core, is a community's attempt to articulate something genuine, that a piece of game music reached something emotional in them as children, something they didn't have words for, something slightly frightening and slightly sad and slightly beyond what a game marketed as cheerful had any business making them feel. The legend is a translation of that feeling into story. It's mythology, in the oldest sense of the word. It is a community explaining, in the language of narrative, something they experienced emotionally that they could not otherwise describe. There is one more layer to this, and it is the strangest one. In 2010, someone uploaded a video claiming to analyze the spectrogram of the Lavender Town theme using specialized software. When played in a specific visual mode, the software apparently generated images that resembled the Pokémon Unown, the alphabet-shaped creatures from gold and silver who exist to spell things in ancient ruins. The Unown, in this analysis, appeared to spell out the words, "Leave now." This was presented as evidence that Game Freak had intentionally embedded a hidden message in the music. The controversy this generated was significant, partly because Unown didn't exist until Generation 2, meaning their appearance in a Generation 1 audio analysis would be genuinely anomalous. The images were fabricated, the analysis was fraudulent, but the reason this particular detail spread so far, and the reason it stuck, is that it touched on something the fandom genuinely believes about Pokémon at a deeper level, that this franchise contains layers upon layers of hidden intention, that things are connected across games and generations in ways that weren't accidental, that if you look closely enough at the right things in the right way, the whole structure of the Pokémon world reveals itself to be something far stranger and more deliberate than anyone wants to officially admit. That belief is not entirely wrong. That's what makes all of this so much fun. Before we move on, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. There's something wonderful about knowing that someone on the other side of the planet is lying in bed in the dark listening to the same things you're listening to right now. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. There's more of this kind of thing coming, and you'll want to be here for it. Section 2. The Shapeshifter's Secret Ditto and the Failed Clone Theory. There is a Pokémon that most people, if they're being honest, didn't think very much about when they were children. It's a small purple blob. It has a flat, unimpressed face. It knows exactly one move. Its entire existence is defined by the ability to become other things, which, when you think about it for longer than 5 seconds, starts to sound less like a quirky gameplay mechanic and more like a creature in the grip of a profound identity crisis. It has no home. It has no purpose except to mirror. It is found, in the original games, in places that don't quite make sense, tucked into routes and caves as if it wandered in from somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. Ditto. National Pokédex number 132. The Transform Pokémon. And if a growing body of fan theory is to be believed, Ditto might be one of the most significant and most tragic Pokémon in the entire franchise. Not because of anything it does, because of what it is. Because of where it came from. Because of what it tells us about the lengths to which human beings in the Pokémon world have gone to play God with genetic material and what gets left behind when those experiments go wrong. The theory, stated plainly, is this. Ditto is not a natural species. Ditto is a failed clone of Mew. Now let's look at why that's not as crazy as it sounds. Mew is canonically, within the games, described as the ancestor of all Pokémon. Its Pokédex entry states that its cells contain the genetic code of every existing Pokémon species. This is why Mew can learn any technical machine, any hidden machine, any move tutor technique. It is the template from which all Pokémon life descended. Its genetic makeup is, essentially, a complete library of all biological Pokémon data that has ever existed. And Mew knows Transform. just like Ditto. In the first generation of games, Mew and Ditto were the only Pokémon capable of using the move Transform. Not Smeargle, who could sketch it, but who didn't have it naturally. Not any of the legendary Pokémon, just Mew and Ditto. Two Pokémon that can become anything. Two Pokémon that contain, between them, the reflected genetic information of all other Pokémon life. The physical similarities are striking once you begin looking for them. Both Mew and Ditto are pink. Both are genderless. Both weigh exactly 8.8 pounds, not approximately the same weight, but exactly the same weight, to the single decimal point. Their shiny variants are both the same shade of light blue, which is a remarkable coincidence for two Pokémon that are not otherwise related. And their base stats follow the same internal logic perfectly balanced across all categories, as though whatever force designed them was attempting to create a complete, undifferentiated template for all Pokémon biology. Mew has base stats of 100 in every category. Ditto has base stats of 48 in every category. The difference is significant, but the pattern is the same. Whatever Ditto is, it was built according to the same blueprint as Mew, with the resulting product coming out diminished, as though the process that created it was attempting to replicate Mew, but only partially succeeded. Then there is the question of where Ditto is found. In the original Pokémon Red and Blue, Ditto appears across several locations in the Kanto region routes near Cerulean City and the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island. These original appearances are already interesting, but it's what happened in Pokémon Yellow that pushed the theory into a different category. In Yellow, Ditto's wild distribution was changed. It no longer appeared on those open routes. Instead, it appeared almost exclusively in two specific locations: the Pokémon Mansion on Cinnabar Island and Cerulean Cave. Think about what those two locations have in common. The Pokémon Mansion is the former research facility of the scientists who created Mewtwo. Its burned-out hallways are full of journals, actual readable documents within the game that describe the cloning experiments, the discovery of Mew in the jungles of South America, the attempt to amplify Mew's genetic potential and produce something stronger. The mansion is ground zero for the experiment that produced Mewtwo. It is also, in Pokémon Yellow, the primary habitat of Wild Ditto. Cerulean Cave is where Mewtwo lives after the events of the game. It is accessible only to the most accomplished trainers, and it's treated by the game's geography and narrative as a location of particular significance. It is the home of the most powerful being created through the cloning experiments. It is also one of the only places in Pokémon Yellow where Wild Ditto can be found. The two locations where Ditto appears naturally are the two locations most directly associated with the Mew to Mewtwo cloning experiment. That is either the most extraordinary coincidence in game design history, or it is an intentional placement by developers who, if they never officially confirmed the theory, were at least willing to arrange the evidence in a way that made it compelling. The journals in the Pokémon Mansion add texture. They describe a cloning process that was iterative, painful, and clearly not something that succeeded on the first attempt. The most famous entry simply reads, "Mewtwo was born. Its power is so overwhelming. We have failed to curb its vicious tendency." But other entries describe the creation process at earlier stages, the discovery of Mew, the extraction of genetic material, the repeated attempts to replicate and amplify. The theory suggests that Ditto is what you get when those earlier attempts fail. When the cloning process produces something that contains Mew's fundamental ability, the capacity to transform into any other Pokémon but fails to replicate Mew's power, identity, or stability. Ditto is a creature without a fixed form because it was created from the genetic template of the one creature that contains all forms, and the process didn't go far enough to give it one of its own. This would explain something that always felt slightly off about Ditto's in-game description. The Pokédex entry for Ditto says that its genetic structure allows it to transform into anything. Not that it evolved this ability, not that it was born with it naturally. That its genetic structure, specifically the word genetic, as though pointing at something deliberate, allows the transformation. The Pokédex, famously, is written from the perspective of human researchers trying to understand Pokémon. If the researchers who wrote the entry for Ditto had any knowledge of or access to the Cinnabar Mansion research, they would know what Ditto's genetic structure was designed to do. There's a wrinkle in the theory, and it's an important one. In an interview that circulated online, the game designer Junichi Masuda was asked directly about the Ditto as Mew clone theory. His response was telling in its deliberate vagueness. He said it was the first time he had heard that rumor. He declined to confirm or deny it. He noted only that, in terms of how Pokémon are designed, each is its own unique living being. That is not a denial. That is a designer's careful, practiced non-answer. It is the kind of response you give when you don't want to lie, but you also don't want to confirm something that the franchise has not officially decided to make canonical. Which means the question remains open. What makes the Ditto theory genuinely compelling beyond just the coincidences of weight and color and base stats is that it maps onto something the games already tell us explicitly. Mewtwo's Pokédex entry calls it the world's most powerful Pokémon, but more importantly, it describes Mewtwo as a Pokémon that was created through years of horrific gene splicing and DNA engineering experiments. That word horrific is in there. In a children's game, the Pokémon world has always been clear that the science of Cinnabar Island was not clean or kind. What doesn't get said explicitly is what happened to all the earlier attempts. What did the scientists do with the failed experiments, the ones that contained fragments of Mew's ability but not the full, stable expression of it? The ones that could transform but couldn't maintain a self? The theory says they became Ditto. And they were released, or they escaped, and they wandered the world, breeding with everything and with anything because Ditto's one remaining echo of Mew's nature is that capacity to interface with any genetic material, a reflection of the fact that Mew's genome contains everything. Ditto doesn't know what it is. It never will. Every form it takes is borrowed. Every battle it fights is as something else. It is the Pokémon franchise's most quietly devastating character, if you read it this way. A creature that was almost something magnificent, settled forever into the sad miracle of almost. Section 3. The boy who never woke up, the Ash Ketchum coma theory. This one is going to take a moment to build properly, because the Ash Ketchum coma theory is the kind of idea that sounds immediately absurd and then, somewhere around the third or fourth piece of evidence, starts doing something uncomfortable to your relationship with an anime you loved as a child. Let's start at the very beginning. Episode 1. Ash Ketchum is 10 years old. He lives in Pallet Town. He has overslept on the most important morning of his life, the day when every 10-year-old in the region can visit Professor Oak's laboratory and choose their first Pokémon, the starter Pokémon, the partner, the beginning of everything. Because he overslept, all three of the traditional starters, Bulbasaur, Charmander, Squirtle, have already been taken by other trainers. What Oak has left, barely contained in a Pokeball, visibly resentful of being held inside something, is a Pikachu, a wild and disobedient electric mouse who does not want to be Ash's Pokémon and is not shy about expressing this through the selective application of thousands of volts of electricity. Ash takes Pikachu anyway. They leave the lab. They walk into the tall grass outside of Pallet Town. Ash sees a Pidgey and tries to catch it. He fails. He accidentally disturbs a flock of Spearow, which are aggressive, and they attack. Ash scoops up Pikachu, who still doesn't want anything to do with him, and runs. He runs. He runs hard. He borrows a bicycle from Misty, who will later become one of his closest friends, but right now is just a girl whose fishing rod he stumbled into. He tears down a hill on the bicycle with an entire flock of Spearow in pursuit, crashes into a lake at the bottom, sees a mysterious golden Pokémon in the sky, above a Pokémon that will later be confirmed to be Ho-Oh, and then he and Pikachu are struck by a massive bolt of lightning. In the show, this is played as a dramatic but survivable moment. Pikachu's electricity deflects the Spearow flock, Ash is singed and dazed but basically fine, and the adventure begins. It is cartoon logic. We accept it and move on. The coma theory says, what if we shouldn't have accepted it? The foundational premise of the theory is simple. A 10-year-old boy was struck by lightning. Not Pikachu's electricity, actual atmospheric lightning, a full bolt in the middle of a storm while soaking wet on a metal bicycle. In the real world, a lightning strike can kill an adult instantly or leave survivors with severe neurological damage that lasts a lifetime. In the first episode of Pokémon, it was presented as Ash being mildly inconvenienced before starting his adventure. The theory says that the inconvenience was not mild. That after the lightning strike, Ash was found unconscious and taken to a hospital, and that what we watch for the next 1,000+ episodes of the anime is not Ash's real journey but the internal landscape of his unconscious mind, a comatose child living out the dream he had always had, the dream of becoming a Pokémon master, playing it out in his head over and over while his body lies still in a bed somewhere. The original version of the theory, the one that circulated in the early days of Pokémon internet fandom, was actually quite sophisticated in its construction. It suggested that the early tone shifts in the anime, the fact that Team Rocket were initially menacing and then became comedic, the fact that the world became more friendly and less threatening as the series progressed, were explained by the progression of medical treatment. In the earliest episodes, Ash's coma is still raw and unstabilized. The world of his dream is harsh and uncertain. Team Rocket are genuinely frightening. The stakes feel real. Then, the theory suggests, the hospital administered medications to stabilize his condition. The coma settled into something more comfortable. The medication took effect and softened the dream, made Team Rocket bumbling instead of dangerous, made every city feel warm and welcoming, made every Pokémon encounter feel joyful rather than tense. The world of the dream became the world a child on sedatives would construct benign, structured, endlessly adventurous without ever being truly dangerous. Let's look at the evidence people marshal for this. The most cited piece is also the most obvious. Ash does not age. He has traveled through 9 distinct regions, participated in the equivalent of decades of adventures, formed deep bonds, experienced loss and growth and change, and he is still, at the start of every new series, 10 years old. The creators have addressed this in various ways over the years, describing it as an anime convention, a choice made to keep the audience consistent, a feature of how the show was structured to allow new children to enter at any point. All of those explanations are perfectly reasonable, but from within the logic of the coma theory, they make a different kind of sense. The boy doesn't age because the boy is unconscious. His mind is frozen at 10. The Ash inside the dream will always be the Ash who went into the coma young, optimistic, about to begin something magnificent, permanently deferred from the moment of beginning. The recurring Nurse Joys and Officer Jenny's identical characters who appear in every town, every city, every region across the world are explained within the coma theory as dream logic. Dreams don't create elaborate individual portraits of medical staff and police officers. They recycle faces. They use the familiar face and assign it new context. Every Nurse Joy is the nurse who attended to Ash in the hospital. Every Officer Jenny is a security figure the child's dreaming mind keeps generating. The fact that Ash's father is never seen, never named, never present, this is framed in the coma theory as a gap in the dream's construction. Ash doesn't know his father well enough to generate a version of him, or the thought of his father is painful in ways the dreaming mind is protecting him from, so the dream simply leaves that space empty. There's a detail in the Pokémon anime that the coma theory finds deeply meaningful, and it has to do with Ho-Oh. In that very first episode, the episode that sets everything in motion, Ash looks up into the storm sky and sees something. A massive, magnificent creature flies overhead, its feathers catch the light. It is unmistakably real and unmistakably extraordinary, and then it's gone. Later games and series would confirm it to be Ho-Oh, the legendary rainbow Pokémon of Gold and Silver. Ho-Oh's Pokédex entry, in Gold and Silver, states that it is said that those who see Ho-Oh are promised eternal happiness. Read that again. Eternal happiness, promised to those who see it. The coma theory interprets this as follows. The last thing Ash saw before he lost consciousness in the lightning strike was Ho-Oh, a legendary Pokémon of immense spiritual significance. And Ho-Oh's promise, the promise baked into its mythology, is eternal happiness. The coma dream is that promise being kept. Ash is happy, perpetually, endlessly in his dream. He catches Pokémon, he makes friends. He battles and loses and grows and battles again. He experiences a kind of life that contains all the joy of the childhood dream of becoming a Pokémon master, without the aging, without the ending, without the loss. It is, the theory suggests, a beautiful prison, a gift that is also a trap, eternal happiness, delivered to a boy who has never woken up. The theory has detractors, and they have good points. The anime has never presented Ash's journey as anything other than real. There are moments of genuine consequence in the series Pokémon that die or leave, friendships that end, losses that matter. If Ash were simply dreaming, these moments would need some explanation within the dream logic. The theory handles this by suggesting that the brain generates conflict even in a coma dream, because a dream with no stakes would not hold the mind's attention. The dream needs to feel real enough to be worth experiencing, and that means it needs occasional losses and genuine difficulty. But it cannot be too difficult, which is why Ash almost always survives, almost always finds a way through, and almost always ends up okay. There is also the question of the other characters. Misty, Brock, May, Dawn, Iris, Serena, the companions who travel with Ash through each region. The theory has to account for them. The most common explanation is that they represent different aspects of Ash's own psyche: his curiosity, his romantic longings, his competitiveness, his capacity for compassion projected outward into companion figures that help him process his inner life while he sleeps. Whether that is too much of a stretch depends on how you feel about psychology. People who find Jungian archetypes compelling will find it elegant. People who think it's overreach will find it absurd. Both positions are defensible. What the coma theory really illuminates, even if you don't believe it for a moment, is something true about the nature of the Pokémon anime. It is a story about a child who never grows up, traveling through an endless series of beautiful places, finding friends everywhere he goes, never truly failing, always moving forward. That is the structure of a very particular kind of dream. It does not need a coma to explain it. It was built that way intentionally, for very practical commercial reasons, because a franchise that kills its protagonist's arc by letting him grow up is a franchise that loses its audience. But the reason the coma theory resonates with so many people is that it articulates something honest about how the show feels when you're old enough to notice the strangeness. The world doesn't quite work the way a real world works. Characters are recycled. Time doesn't move. No one mentions the past unless it's convenient. The protagonist carries no visible scars from his losses. Everything resets. It feels like a dream because it was designed to feel like a dream. The coma theory is just the most committed, most loving, most disturbing version of that observation. Section 4. The World After War. The Great Pokémon Conflict Theory. There is something missing from Kanto. When you play Pokémon Red and Blue for the first time as a child, you don't notice it. You're busy catching things and battling things and navigating mazes of small boys who want to fight you every 15 seconds. The world feels full. It feels alive. Pallet Town is small but warm. Pewter City has its museum. Cerulean has its bridge and its mysterious underwater cave. Vermilion has its ship. But if you step back and look at the map of Kanto with adult eyes, or even with the eyes of a slightly suspicious child, something becomes apparent. This is a world populated almost entirely by children, old people, and women. The young adult men are largely absent. You'll find gym leaders, yes. You'll find the occasional NPC sailor or the rare townsperson with a male sprite. But the fathers? The young dads? The brothers in their 20s and 30s? The men who should be present in ordinary civic life? They are not there. Your own father is never mentioned. Not once. He doesn't appear. He isn't referenced in dialogue. He doesn't send you a letter or a gift. He simply does not exist within the story. Your rival, Blue or Gary, if you prefer the anime's naming, is being raised by his grandfather, Professor Oak. His parents are absent. Not dead, explicitly. Just not there. Not present. Not part of the world that the game presents to you. And then, in the gym in Vermilion City, you meet a man in military fatigues. Lieutenant Surge is one of the 8 gym leaders of the Kanto region. He is called the Lightning American in the original Japanese text, which places him as someone who came from outside the region from somewhere that corresponds, within the Pokémon world's geography, to a place inspired by the United States. He is built like a soldier. He carries himself like a man who has seen things. He is aggressive with trainers who come to challenge him. And when you defeat him, he says something that lands differently once you've heard the theory. You won't live long in combat, that's for sure. I tell you what, Kid Electric Pokémon saved me during the war. They zapped my enemies into paralysis. The war? He doesn't say which war. He doesn't say when. He doesn't say how it ended or who was fighting or what was at stake. He mentions it the way people who have been through something terrible mention it when they are not really talking to you, when they are talking to themselves, processing something they haven't finished processing. The war is a given in Surge's mind. The war is the context in which everything makes sense. For decades, this single line of dialogue was treated as background flavor, just something that made Surge feel more interesting, more grounded, more like a real character. It was one line. What could it mean? The Great Pokémon War Theory says it means everything. The theory, which has been assembled across years of forum discussion and community analysis, proposes that there was a significant military conflict in the recent history of the Pokémon world, recent enough that Lieutenant Surge fought in it, but long enough ago that the children who are now 10 were born into a post-war world. The conflict, in the most common version of the theory, devastated the male population of fighting-age adults, which is why the Kanto region's demographics look so strange. The fathers died in the war. The brothers died in the war. What's left is old people, children, and the women who built a new world around the ruins of the old one. This framing explains several things that otherwise feel like unexplained design choices. The abundance of Pokémon centers and gyms relative to other civic infrastructure is one of them. If you were trying to rebuild a society after a devastating military conflict and your economy was organized around Pokémon battling, you would prioritize the medical facilities and training infrastructure above everything else. Entertainment, culture, normal peacetime commerce, these come later. The gyms and the centers came first, because they were essential to the society's recovery. The underground passage systems, which in a modern peaceful city would be commuter tunnels or utility access points, are structured in a way that fans have noted looks more like wartime infrastructure emergency shelters built beneath the major population centers in case whatever drove Kanto to war came back. There is even in Vermilion City a building under construction. One lone man and his Machop are putting it back together, slowly, across the entire length of the game. In a peaceful, prosperous city, you might see development, construction, but you wouldn't typically see a single man slowly rebuilding a single structure with Pokémon labor. That is what reconstruction looks like. That is what a city that was damaged looks like, years after the damage. The theory gets more specific when it engages with the question of where the war was fought and who was involved. The most widely circulated version suggests that Kanto and Johto, the two regions that were later confirmed to be geographically adjacent in gold and silver, fought against each other. This would explain certain cultural tensions and cultural overlaps between the two regions, and it would explain why, in gold and silver, the people of Johto feel simultaneously familiar and slightly foreign to anyone coming from Kanto. They were enemies, once. Now they are neighbors trying to forget. The more specific version involving Lieutenant Surge places him as an outside participant in the conflict, an American soldier or mercenary from a region inspired by the United States, who fought in the Kanto War using electric Pokémon as weapons. The Japanese text calling him the Lightning American was not just a nickname. This version of the theory argues it was a descriptor. He was American. He was there. His electric Pokémon kept him alive. This implies something fairly dark about how Pokémon were used in this conflict. If Surge's electric Pokémon zapped his enemies into paralysis, which is a specific combat application, not just a general reference to having had a Pokémon by his side, then Pokémon in the Kanto world were used as weapons of war. Not just as companions or as sporting opponents, as weapons. Living weapons trained to disable human beings. Later games added dimensions to this theory that the original creators might not have entirely intended. In the Pokémon World Tournament event in Black and White, which brings together gym leaders from across the series' history, Lieutenant Surge appears and is introduced with a reference to his American origins. The event's announcer seems unsure whether Surge is from Unova, the region inspired by New York that serves as the setting for Black and White. This is a small detail, but it connects Surge to the Unova region, and Unova, it turns out, has its own history of war. Deep in the lore of Black and White, accessible through environmental storytelling and NPC dialogue, there are references to a large-scale conflict in Unova's past. The conflict, known in the lore as the War of Truth and Ideals, is the event that fractured the original dragon of Unova into the three separate legendary Pokémon Reshiram, Zekrom, and Kyurem. This war was ancient, not recent, but its scars are written into the geography of the region in ways that feel deliberate. The theory suggests that the Kanto War may have been connected to or even inspired by these deeper conflicts in the Pokémon world's history. That battling, as a sport and as a social institution, emerged in part from a world that had recently used Pokémon to do something much more serious than sport. That the whole apparatus of gyms and Pokémon centers and the Pokémon League is, at some level, a sublimation of military culture. A way for a post-war society to channel its instinct for conflict into something organized and rule-bound, and eventually harmless. There is one more figure in this theory who rarely gets the attention he deserves. Mr. Fuji, the old man who lives in Lavender Town and tends to the Pokémon graves, is, in the original Japanese text, identified as Dr. Fuji, a scientist. And in the Pokémon anime episode that explored the origin of Mewtwo, a doctor Fuji was depicted as one of the scientists involved in the cloning experiments at Cinnabar Island. His motivation, in the anime's telling, was grief. He had lost his daughter Amber, and he was drawn to the cloning project because it promised the technology to restore her. If Mr. Fuji of Lavender Town and the Dr. Fuji of the Mewtwo origin story are the same person, then his presence in the town of the dead takes on a different weight. He is a man who participated in something terrible, who tried to use science to undo a personal loss, who ended up contributing to the creation of something that cannot be controlled. And now he lives in the cemetery. He tends to dead Pokémon. He gives away Pokéflutes to children who need to move on. There is no explicit confirmation that these two characters are the same man. The games are carefully vague about it, but the theory holds that he is the war's most tragic figure, the scientist who survived both a real conflict and a scientific catastrophe, who ended up in the only place in Kanto that is openly, unashamedly, unreservedly a place for grief. The town with the cemetery, the town with the strange music, the town where Cubone's mother was killed by Team Rocket while protecting her child. Everything in Lavender Town is a kind of aftermath. Section 5. The missing numbers, missing no, and the secret architecture of Pokemon's glitch mythology. Let's talk about M. Not missing no. Not yet though, we'll get there. Let's start with M, because M is the glitch that the theorists find most interesting, and it is the one that has accumulated the strangest and most compelling body of interpretation. M is a glitch Pokemon in Pokemon Red and Blue. It appears at level 0. Its sprite is the same backwards L shape of corrupted data as missing no itself, but its behavior is different. If you catch a M and allow it to level up to level 100, it evolves. Not into missing no, not into anything you've seen before in the Pokédex. It evolves into Kangaskhan. That is not a coincidence. That is not random data corruption producing a random result. In an 8-bit game on a Game Boy cartridge, the probability of corrupted data at index slot 000 randomly triggering the evolution sequence for one specific, thematically relevant Pokemon would be vanishingly small if the connection were entirely accidental. And Kangaskhan is not a random choice. Kangaskhan is specifically and deeply linked to some of the most interesting theories in the entire franchise. We'll come back to why that matters when we get to Cubone. But keep it in mind, missing no is the most famous glitch in gaming history. This is not a hyperbolic claim. It is the glitch that was covered by Nintendo Power and Strategy Guides. It is the glitch that defined the word glitch for a generation of children who had never heard it before. It is the glitch that made a generation of players approach their video games as things that could be broken, could be probed, could be understood from angles the designers hadn't intended. The basic mechanics of missing no are well understood by now. In Pokemon Red and Blue, the game stores encounter data in a specific memory location that gets loaded when a trainer sees you and initiates a battle. If you watch the old man in Viridian City demonstrate how to catch a Pokemon, the game temporarily stores his name in the memory slot normally reserved for your player name, overwriting your character's name during the sequence. When you then fly to Cinnabar Island and surf along its eastern coast, a coastline that lacks the proper programming to reset the encounter data, the game tries to load encounters from whatever data happens to be sitting in the relevant memory slots. What it finds there is a combination of your player name's character values, interpreted as Pokemon index numbers. Depending on your name, different glitch Pokemon appear. For most standard names and letter selections from the era, one of the common results was missing no. When you encounter missing no, strange things happen. Your 6th item's quantity increases to a number above 128. Your Hall of Fame data becomes corrupted and displays strange images. The world briefly becomes legible as code rather than as a game. For years, the received wisdom on missing no was that it was purely accidental blank spaces in the Pokédex index table that got read as data and generated nonsense sprites. A mistake, nothing more. But as the research community got more sophisticated, and especially after the 2020 Nintendo data leak that made the source code of Pokemon Blue available to researchers, the picture became more complicated. Missing no, in its base form, has a Pokédex entry. The entry reads, in the original Japanese text, "Comment under construction." This is not the Pokédex entry of pure garbage data. This is the Pokédex entry of a placeholder, a creature that was assigned a slot in the development process, was given a temporary text entry, and was never removed before the game shipped. In the localized English versions, this text was not properly translated and became the height and weight numbers that some players remember finding in their Pokédex for missing no. But the underlying content is clearly intentional development artifact. The 39 different missing no entities found in the game each occupy a specific index number, and 9 of them have unique audio cries that are located in the game's sound table in positions between legitimate Pokémon cries. This arrangement strongly suggests that at least some of these slots were filled with real data at some point in development. The cry data is not garbage. It was placed there deliberately by someone working on the game who had something in mind for that slot. The 2020 source code leak confirmed what the researchers had suspected. Many of the missing no slots were occupied, in early versions of the game, by sprites corresponding to Pokémon that were cut from the final release. Some of these sprites match descriptions and designs from Satoshi Tajiri's biographical materials. Others correspond to Pokémon that would not appear until later generations, raising the genuinely remarkable possibility that some Generation 2 Pokémon were in development before Generation 1 even shipped, and their placeholder data remained in the code even as they were removed from the first game. This is where the theory takes its most compelling form. Missing no is not a mistake. Missing no is an artifact of a process. The process by which a game gets made, by which creatures get designed and abandoned and redesigned and cut and moved, and eventually, sometimes, resurrected in a different form in a later game. What missing no represents is the game's hidden history, its unused depths, the things that were almost Pokémon, that sat in development for months before being removed, whose data was never fully erased. The fan community has long maintained that some of the cut Pokémon from the original development eventually became Gold and Silver Pokémon. Marill was clearly in development before Gold and Silver shipped. It appeared in the first Pokémon movie as what many international fans initially assumed was a new reveal. Some of the beta Gold and Silver Pokémon documented in development materials that later surfaced online show designs that were clearly iterative versions of what became Generation 2 and even Generation 3 creatures. If some of the missing no slots correspond to those cut Pokémon, then the glitch creature you encountered on Cinnabar's coast was, in a very real sense, a ghost, a creature that had existed in development, that had been given a cry and a sprite and a Pokédex slot number, and that had then been removed from the game before it could be completed. The game couldn't delete it entirely. The data remained. And when the encounter system went looking for something in that empty space, it found the ghost. The thing about missing no that has always been most powerful, most resonant, most persistently interesting to the community that grew up with it is that it feels intentional. Even though it is not, in a strict technical sense, an intentional design choice, the encounter feels meaningful. It feels like the game is showing you something it was not supposed to show you. Like you opened a door that wasn't meant to open and found yourself looking at the drafts, the discards, the abandoned work of a team of developers who were trying to build a world and couldn't fit everything they imagined into 1 megabyte. There is a theory that goes further than all of these. It is the theory that connects missing no, not just to the development history of the games, but to the thematic structure of the Pokémon world itself. The theory argues that missing no is, within the fiction of the Pokémon universe, a kind of test. Professor Oak, in the game, gives you the Pokédex and tells you to complete it. The Pokédex has 150 entries later, updated to 151 with Mew, and it represents the complete catalog of known Pokémon life. Oak is a scientist. The Pokédex is his research instrument, and you are his research assistant. But a good scientist doesn't assume the known list is complete. A good scientist leaves room for the unknown. And the theory suggests that the empty slots in the Pokédex, the missing no entries, are Professor Oak's acknowledgement that the catalog is incomplete. That there are things in the world that haven't been found and named yet. That the number 150 or 151 is a practical limit rather than a real one. Missing no is what happens when the game allows you to glimpse the space beyond the known. The game's systems weren't designed to handle it. The encounter code wasn't designed to load creatures from those empty slots. When it does, the result is chaos-corrupted sprites, impossible numbers, Hall of Fame data that turns into noise. But the encounter itself is real. Missing no is a real encounter. It fights back, it has stats, it has moves, It has a level and a type and everything a Pokémon needs except an identity, a name that means something, a place in the world. That is not a mistake, the theory says. That is a mirror. The world of Pokémon is a world of order trainers and routes and gym leaders and a Pokémon League. Everything cataloged and named and understood. Missing no is what lives in the spaces between the ordered things. It is what you find when you go to the edges of the known map and look over the side. Section 6. The Skull and the Pouch Cubone, Kangaskhan, and the Darkest Evolution Theory. Here is something that the Pokédex is clear about from the very beginning. Cubone wears the skull of its dead mother. This is not subtext. This is not something you have to read between the lines to find. The game tells you. The skull on Cubone's head is the skull of its mother. The bone it uses as a weapon is its mother's bone. When Cubone cries, and it cries frequently, especially at the full moon, which it mistakes for its mother's face, the skull vibrates with the sound, as if the mother's remains are responding to the child. This is extraordinarily dark. This is the kind of lore that, when you read it as a child, passes through you without fully landing, because you don't yet have the emotional vocabulary to process what it means. You understand it as sad. You don't understand it as the specific kind of sad it is a child carrying the literal physical remains of its parent as armor and as weapon, never able to separate the protection from the grief, growing into an adult version of itself called Marowak, where the skull has fused to its head entirely, where the grief has become structural. Cubone cannot evolve without the skull on its head. The skull is the condition of its development. Its grief is the thing that makes it what it is. If you find an orphaned Cubone and raise it with love and care, it will still evolve into Marowak, still carrying the skull, still unable to take it off. There is no evolutionary path where Cubone heals. There is only a path where the grief becomes integrated. Now comes the theory. The popular and long-standing fan theory about Cubone and Kangaskhan proposes that these two Pokémon are not separate species but different expressions of the same life cycle, specifically that Cubone is what a baby Kangaskhan becomes when its mother dies. The physical evidence is striking when you lay it out. A baby Kangaskhan, visible in its mother's pouch in the games and anime, has an oval head, small clawed limbs, a long stump tail, and large round eyes. Cubone has an oval head under its skull mask, small clawed limbs, a long stump tail, and when the skull is depicted without the mask, large round eyes. The skull that Cubone wears is shaped like the head of an adult Kangaskhan. The proportions of the skull, the muzzle, the ridge above the eye sockets, the general cranial architecture correspond to an adult Kangaskhan's head. In other words, if a baby Kangaskhan's mother died, the skull available to the orphaned infant would be the skull of an adult Kangaskhan, which is the skull that Cubone wears. The Boomerang, Cubone's signature move, is named after a boomerang. Kangaskhan's name comes from a kangaroo. Kangaroos and boomerangs are both Australian cultural references, suggesting a shared thematic origin in the design of these two Pokémon. Kangaskhan is a female-only species. It has no male counterpart and no prior evolution. In a franchise that generally gives Pokémon complete family trees pre-evolutions for the baby, main forms for the adult Kangaskhan stands alone. There is no Kangaskhan egg form, no juvenile Kangaskhan outside of the pouch. The theory says, there is. It's called Cubone. The coding evidence is the most compelling piece. In the very early development of Pokémon Red and Blue, according to theories developed from the leaked source code and confirmed by some data miners, Marowak was coded with an evolution. That evolution, according to the data, was Kangaskhan. The three-stage family was Cubone, Marowak, Kangaskhan, connected in a chain. Before the game shipped, the chain was broken. Kangaskhan was given a separate index number and reclassified as a standalone species with no evolutionary relationship to the others. The connection was severed in the code. Why? One theory points to the thematic darkness of what a Cubone-Marowak-Kangaskhan chain would mean. If players understood that Cubone was a baby Kangaskhan orphaned by its mother's death, and that by raising it lovingly to adulthood it would eventually become a Kangaskhan, which is to say, they would eventually become a mother itself, they would understand that the entire evolutionary chain is about grief and recovery, about a creature traumatized by loss becoming the source of nurture for the next generation. That is a profound story. It is also a story that might have been deemed too dark, too explicitly concerned with death and loss and generational trauma, for a game marketed to children. The theory says Game Freak looked at what they had designed, understood what it meant, and decided to obscure it. Not remove it entirely, the Cubone skull is still explicitly the mother's skull. The grief is still there, but to break the obvious connection, to make it something you had to work to see rather than something the game handed you. Missing no connects to this theory in the form of M, the glitch creature that, when raised to level 100, evolves into Kangaskhan. The theory, at its most elaborate, proposes that the original Marowak, the evolution of Cubone that was supposed to lead to Kangaskhan, was not deleted from the code entirely. It was moved. It was placed in an empty slot, given the placeholder name that became M and missing no, and left in the game as an artifact that could not be fully removed. When you encounter M and raise it, and it evolves into Kangaskhan, you are, within this framework, completing the evolutionary chain that Game Freak decided not to show you. You are raising the orphaned thing to the point where it can become a mother. Whether or not you accept every detail of this theory, there is something true at its core. Cubone is one of the most narratively dense Pokémon ever designed. Its entire design is a statement about loss, not an abstract loss, not the loss of a beloved object, but the loss of a mother, experienced by a child who cannot grow beyond that loss, without carrying it physically, permanently, into every future version of itself. The skull doesn't come off. The grief doesn't go away. It becomes who you are. In a franchise that is often discussed as though it were only about the joy of collection and the satisfaction of competition, Cubone stands as evidence that something else was always happening. That underneath the cheerful surface, the designers were thinking about hard things, about death, about children without parents, about what it means to grow up carrying something you never asked to carry. And if the Kangaskhan theory is right, there's even a kind of hope buried in it. You grow up, you grow past the skull, you become the thing you lost, so that something else doesn't have to be what you were. Section 7. The Shadow and its double Gengar, Clefable, and the Mirror Theory. Look at Gengar. Really look at it. Put the idea of what Gengar is supposed to be aside for a moment, the ghost, the prankster, the slightly menacing presence that has become one of the franchise's most beloved characters, and just look at the shape of it. Wide, rounded, low center of gravity, stubby limbs, pointed ears, small eyes positioned in the upper half of a large circular face, a tail. Now look at Clefable. Wider, more rounded, lower center of gravity, stubbier limbs, pointed ears, large eyes positioned in the upper half of a large circular face, a slightly different tail. These two Pokémon are, when you compare them silhouette to silhouette, essentially the same shape. Not similar shapes, the same shape. The proportions are almost identical. The features map onto each other point for point. Gengar is darker, spikier, slightly more angular in its details. Clefable is lighter, rounder, slightly more soft in its contours, but the underlying structure is the same body. The Gengar as Clefable shadow theory is one of the oldest in the Pokémon fandom, and it is also one of the best supported. In the first generation of Pokémon games, before the type chart was revised in Generation 6, Gengar was a ghost, poison type, and Clefable was a normal type. These two types had a specific and significant relationship. Normal-type moves do not affect Ghost-type Pokémon, and Ghost-type moves do not affect Normal-type Pokémon. In game terms, they are immune to each other's primary attacks. A shadow cannot hurt the thing that casts it. The thing that casts a shadow cannot be harmed by it. This is the core of the theory. Gengar and Clefable were designed to be immune to each other not because of a random type chart decision, but because they are the same entity in two different states, the light form and the shadow form, divided. They cannot hurt each other because you cannot attack your own shadow. They share a body shape because a shadow is defined by the shape of the thing that casts it. The moon is a recurring theme in both Pokémon's designs. Clefable is said to be shy and elusive, appearing only in moonlight on certain mountains. Gengar lurks in shadows, and shadows of course require light. Where there is moonlight, there is shadow. Where Clefable dances in the lunar glow, Gengar waits in the dark that the light creates. The Pokédex entries for Gengar feed this reading in specific ways. Gengar is classified as the Shadow Pokémon. Not Ghost, not Dark, Shadow. Its classification is the shadow itself. And numerous Pokédex entries across different games describe Gengar's behavior as hiding in shadows, to prey on unsuspecting victims, sneaking up behind a person while hiding in their shadow, waiting for the person to lower their guard. This is not just spooky flavor text. This is a creature whose entire mode of existence involves shadow, whose classification is shadow, and whose design mirrors a specific other Pokémon exactly. Gengar was one of the original Pokémon present in the very first game, battling Nidorino in the famous opening sequence of Red and Blue that plays before the title screen appears. And Clefairy was, famously, the Pokémon that was originally supposed to be Ash's partner in the anime and the franchise mascot before Pikachu was chosen. Clefairy was one of the first Pokémon designed. Gengar, appearing in that same opening sequence, was designed at roughly the same time. The theory says they were designed together. They were designed as a pair, the same body in two different states, one of light and one of shadow, one normal and one ghost, one benign and one frightening. The pairing was intentional from the start. Game Freak has never officially confirmed this theory. When interviewers have asked about the Gengar-Clefable connection, the developers have given the same careful non-answers they give about the Ditto-Mew connection, neither confirming nor denying, neither validating nor dismissing. But in 2020, the official Pokémon social media account posted a Valentine's Day image. It depicted Clefable and Gengar holding hands. That image went viral in the community almost instantly, not because of the Valentine's framing, but because of what it seemed to say about the relationship between these two Pokémon. The Pokémon Company, which controls what goes on those accounts and what the franchise communicates officially, chose to put those two Pokémon together. In a franchise with hundreds of Pokémon to choose from, in a Valentine's post that could have featured any romantic or companionable pairing, they chose Gengar and Clefable. The theorists treated this as close to confirmation as they were likely to get. Not a statement, not a press release, but a choice, a deliberate curation of imagery that said, even if it couldn't say it directly, yes, these two belong together. The theory has a darker extension that came later, after the Generation 6 games reclassified Clefable from normal type to fairy type. With Clefable now a fairy type, the relationship between the two Pokémon changed. Ghost-type moves now affect fairy-type Pokémon, and fairy-type moves can damage ghost types. The immunity was broken. The shadow and the light can now hurt each other. Some theorists found this devastating. They had built a framework in which the mutual immunity was the keystone of the theory. The shadow cannot harm what casts it, and with the type reclassification, that was gone. Others found it even more interesting, because a new connection became visible. Poison-type moves, which are Gengar's secondary type, are super effective against fairy types. If Gengar is Clefable's shadow or dead counterpart, then Gengar, the one thing that shares its body, is also the one thing most capable of hurting it. This was read by the darker interpreters of the theory as follows. The shadow harms what it cannot see itself. The ghost of a thing is what most deeply wounds what it was. Clefable's worst enemy is its own shadow, its own death, the version of itself that didn't survive. That is melancholy enough to feel true. Section 8. The Boy with No Name N, Zoroark, and the Theory of the Living Illusion. In Pokémon Black and White, the 5th generation of the main series games released in 2010, there is a character unlike anyone you've met before in the franchise. His name is N, just N. His full name, revealed later in the story, is Natural Harmonia Gropius, a name so unusual that it immediately signals something different, something intended, something deliberate. He has long green hair and pale skin, and a way of moving through the world that feels slightly out of register with the way everyone else moves. He is idealistic to the point of being unsettling. He believes, with the fervor of someone who has never been given a reason to doubt, that Pokémon are enslaved by their trainers, and that the only moral course of action is to separate humans and Pokémon forever. He can hear Pokémon. Not as sounds, he can understand their thoughts, their feelings, their inner lives. He was raised in a room full of toys, isolated from other children, allowed to play only with Pokémon. He was raised this way, it is eventually revealed, by Getsis, the true villain of the story, a man who used N's idealism and unique abilities as a tool to try to conquer Unova. Getsis consistently described N as having the heart of a Pokémon, a phrase that, in context, sounds metaphorical. Fans became increasingly sure it wasn't. The N is a Zoroark theory has been circulating since the game's release. It proposes that N is not a human being at all, but rather a Zoroark, the master of illusions. Pokémon whose primary ability is to disguise itself as a human or another Pokémon and sustain that disguise indefinitely. The supporting evidence begins with a specific moment in Pokémon Black and White 2, the sequel set 2 years after the original games. In the post-game content, the player is following a Zoroark through the Victory Road area. The Zoroark leads you to the ruins of N's castle, then disappears into the structure. You enter to find N waiting for you inside. The Zoroark is nowhere to be found. N was not shown to have any Pokémon with him at this point in the story. He had released all of his companions except for the legendary dragon he used to reshape the region. There is no accounting for the Zoroark. It leads you to N and then is gone. If it were N's Zoroark returned to its Pokeball, N would need to have a Pokeball, but he famously had none at that point. If it escaped to a hiding spot, the game should have acknowledged it. Instead, it simply ceases to exist in the narrative the moment you step through the door and find N. The theory says the Zoroark didn't go anywhere. It became N. The flashback trigger is the most intriguing mechanical detail in the theory. Pokémon Black and White has a series of flashback sequences, moments when you interact with a character and are shown their memories, their past, their history. These flashbacks are triggered by the game's scripting system in a standard way. You interact with the character, the sequence triggers, but there is one flashback that doesn't work this way. At a specific point in the game, there is a flashback showing N as a child, listening to Team Plasma grunts through a wall. This is a memory of N's past. But the trigger for this flashback is not interacting with N. It is interacting with a nearby Zoroark. Read that again. The memory that belongs to N that is presented as N's childhood memory is triggered by interacting with the Zoroark, not with N himself. Within the game's mechanical logic, this makes no sense if N and the Zoroark are different individuals. A character's memories are accessed by interacting with that character. The only reason a Zoroark would hold N's memories is if the Zoroark is N if the creature carries N's history within itself because it is the thing that has been presenting as N. Getsis, the manipulator behind N's role in the story, provides additional evidence. He repeatedly describes N in ways that sound like insults but might be literal descriptions. He says N has the heart of a Pokémon. He refers to N as something other than a real human in various loaded pieces of dialogue. Getsis is a manipulator and a liar, but even manipulators and liars tend to let truth slip when they're frustrated, and Getsis's contempt for N seems grounded in something specific, the contempt of someone who knows the truth about what N is and understands that no one else does. If Getsis found a Zoroark in the wild and recognized what it could do if he understood that this Pokémon could sustain a human disguise indefinitely, could learn to behave as a human child, could be raised in isolation to believe in Getsis's mission, then using that Pokémon as the face of Team Plasma's ideological agenda makes a certain kind of terrible sense. A Zoroark who genuinely believes in the liberation of Pokémon, who can hear and understand Pokémon because it is one, who has the inherent capacity to win the trust and alliance of legendary Pokémon. Because of its Pokémon nature, this would be a far more effective figurehead than any human idealist could be. Getsis used N. Getsis always knew what N was, and the player never finds out, because the game never explicitly states it. There is a counter-argument, and it's a strong one. At the end of Pokémon Black and White, N battles the player using either Reshiram or Zekrom, one of the most powerful legendary Pokémon in the world. After the battle, in the sequels, the same Zoroark that appears to lead the player to N is confirmed by some analyses to be N's own Pokémon, released and then choosing to remain loyal to N even without a Pokéball. Under this reading, the Zoroark leading the player to N is simply a devoted companion that followed N because it wanted to, and the theory collapses back into coincidence. But the flashback trigger remains. That detail does not collapse. The only way the flashback works mechanically, the only way a Zoroark interaction can trigger a memory belonging to N, is if the game's scripting system treats them as the same entity. Maybe Game Freak made a scripting error. Maybe the trigger was assigned to the wrong character by a tired developer working on a deadline. That's possible. Or maybe they did it on purpose. Maybe they put the truth in the code where almost no one would look for it, in a mechanic so obscure that it would only be noticed by the kind of player who pays attention to everything, who reads the game from its edges inward, who cannot help but notice when the world doesn't quite add up to itself. When you turn the letter N 90 degrees clockwise, it becomes a Z. This is either a coincidence so remarkable it borders on the miraculous, or it was put there deliberately by someone who wanted you to find it. Section 9. In the beginning, the Arceus and Mew paradox. At the center of the Pokémon mythology, there is a question that Game Freak has never answered clearly. They may have never intended to answer it. The question is this: which came first? In the beginning, in the deepest, oldest layer of the Pokémon world's cosmology, what existed? Before the regions? Before the trainers? Before the gyms and the Pokédex and the battles and the friendships? What was there? The Pokédex gives you two different answers, depending on which Pokémon you're reading about, and both answers cannot be true simultaneously. Mew's Pokédex entry says it is the ancestor of all Pokémon. This is categorical. All Pokémon descended from Mew. Mew is the genetic foundation of the entire Pokémon world. Its cells contain the DNA of every other species, and from that raw genetic material, diversity emerged. This is an evolutionary model, one original thing, differentiated over time into the thousands of species we know. Arceus's Pokédex entry says it is described in mythology as the Pokémon that shaped the universe with its 1,000 arms. This is categorical in a different direction. Arceus is the creator. The universe was shaped by Arceus. This implies that Pokémon existence, and therefore Mew's existence, is downstream of Arceus. Arceus made the thing that Mew descended from, or Arceus made Mew itself. But Arceus is a Pokémon, and if Mew is the ancestor of all Pokémon, then Mew is the ancestor of Arceus, which means Mew came before Arceus, which means Arceus could not have created the universe that contains Mew. Circular? Impossible. A snake eating its own tail. This paradox has generated more creative theorizing per square inch than perhaps any other problem in the franchise. It is the Pokémon version of the theological problem of creation ex nihilo. If something had to create the universe, who created the creator? Mapped onto a fictional world populated by creatures that children use to hit each other for sport. Let's go through the main theories, because each of them reveals something different about how the community thinks about the franchise's mythology. The most common resolution is the simplest. Mew's ancestor of all Pokémon status refers to natural Pokémon that evolved, diversified, and exist as part of the natural world. Arceus and the other legendaries are not natural Pokémon in this sense. They are closer to divine beings, entities that predate the natural world and created it. Under this framework, Arceus created the universe, created Dialga and Palkia to govern time and space, created Giratina to govern antimatter, created Uxie and Mesprit and Azelf to govern spirit and emotion and willpower, and somewhere in this process created Mew, or allowed the conditions for Mew to arise, and from Mew, all natural Pokémon life descended. The problem with this theory is Mew's ability. Mew can learn any move and can transform into any Pokémon, including Arceus, including Dialga, including all the legendaries. The canonical justification for this ability is that Mew's genetic makeup contains all Pokémon DNA. If Mew can become Arceus, then Mew must carry Arceus's genetic code. If Mew's genetic code contains everything, including the DNA of its creator, then, in a very real sense, Mew contains Arceus, which makes the relationship between them very strange. The second major theory is the one that a fan posted to Reddit, and that was picked up by gaming media, which proposed a resolution via time paradox. Dialga controls time. It is said that time began flowing when Dialga was born, and that Dialga's heartbeat is the pulse of time itself. Palkia controls space. Giratina controls antimatter, the shadow of the material universe. The theory proposes that Arceus and Mew both precede Dialga, that they exist in a state before time, in a kind of primordial non-moment that isn't governed by the forward flow of causation. In this state before time, there is no first and no second. There is no sequence. Arceus and Mew are both prior to everything else, in a way that makes the question of which came first meaningless. They both just are, in the way that theological traditions describe the divine as existing outside of time entirely. Arceus then creates Dialga, creates time itself, and at the moment time begins, Mew becomes the ancestor of all Pokémon, because ancestry requires time, causation, before and after. The act of creating time is what makes Mew's primacy meaningful. And Arceus, being before time, is both the creator and also, in a paradoxical sense, a creature that exists prior to the category of creature, making the question of whether it was descended from Mew inapplicable. This theory is elegant. It is also the kind of theory that makes your head hurt if you push on it too hard. But the headache is part of the point. The Pokémon creation mythology was never intended to be logically coherent in the way a naturalistic account of origins would be. It was designed to feel ancient, to feel mythological. Myths don't resolve their contradictions, they hold them, the way the real world's creation myths hold theirs. Because the resolution of the paradox is not the point, the paradox is the point. The thing that cannot be figured out is the thing that marks the edge of human understanding, the place where the narrative defers to mystery. What makes the Arceus-Mew paradox particularly interesting is what it tells us about Game Freak's approach to building their world. Mew was created first. It was created by the original team, before Arceus was a concept. It was hidden in the game as a secret, a reward for insiders, an Easter egg. It was surrounded by mythology, the mythical Pokémon, the last one, the one that contains everything, and that mythology, accumulated across fan culture in the years between Generation 1 and Generation 4, created a sense of Mew as something sacred. When Game Freak introduced Arceus in Generation 4 as the literal creator god of the Pokémon world, they were not contradicting Mew's significance, they were adding a new layer above it. Arceus did not replace Mew's mythology. It complicated it. It asked fans to hold two ideas simultaneously, that Mew is the ancestor of all Pokémon, and that Arceus is the creator of all things. The two statements exist in tension, and that tension has been generating creative thought and discussion for 15 years. There is a version of this story in which Arceus created Mew deliberately, in which the first thing the creator god of the Pokémon universe did was create a creature whose genome contained all possible Pokémon life, a living seed of the entire biological world, and allowed that seed to diversify over millions of years into everything we see. Under this reading, Mew is not a competitor to Arceus's supremacy, but rather Arceus's most significant work, the one creation from which all others followed. Mew as the first Pokémon created by Arceus. Arceus as the god who chose to express its creative will through a single, impossibly complex creature rather than generating each species directly. The two Pokédex entries are not contradictory under this reading. They are two descriptions of the same event from different perspectives. One from the inside of biological Pokémon life, where Mew is the origin point, and one from outside it, where Arceus is the ultimate source. But let's go one layer deeper, because the theorists always go one layer deeper. If Arceus created Mew, then Mew's genetic code, which contains all Pokémon DNA including Arceus's, means that Mew was created by Arceus with a copy of Arceus's own genetic material already included. Arceus built itself into the foundation of the biological Pokémon world. Every Pokémon that descended from Mew carries, somewhere in its genetic makeup, a fragment of the creator's code. This would explain Mewtwo's extraordinary power. Mewtwo is a clone of Mew, a direct copy, amplified. If Mew's genome contains Arceus's genetic material, then Mewtwo is not just the most powerful clone of a mythical Pokémon. Mewtwo is an amplified copy of something that contains, buried deep in its DNA, information about the creator of the universe. This is why Mewtwo's power is described as overwhelming, as godlike, as something that could not be controlled even by the scientists who created it. Mewtwo is the god's genome, amplified in a laboratory by people who didn't know what they were touching. And ditto, the failed clones left behind in the Pokémon Mansion carries that same code in its amorphous, diminished, shape-shifting form. The failures. The things that weren't strong enough to hold the information intact, but couldn't fully let it go either. The entire Cinnabar Island story becomes, under this framework, a story about human beings trying to understand creation itself, trying to replicate the first Pokémon, trying to work backward from the ancestor to the thing before the ancestor. They create something terrible, and something sad, and something that can become anything but never chooses to be itself. Section 10. The edges of the map, smaller theories, stranger connections, and what lies beyond the known. We've covered the large ones, the legends, the theories that have shaped how the fandom understands the franchise at a structural level. But there are smaller theories, stranger, quieter, more personal, that deserve their own time. Each of them is a slightly different angle on the same large question. What is the Pokémon world actually like, underneath the cheerful surface? What did the designers put in there that they never said out loud? Let's move through them gently, because we're getting close to the end of our journey, and these smaller ones deserve the same attention as the large ones. There is the parasect theory, which suggests that the Pokémon most people assume to be a living creature is actually already dead. Parasect is the evolved form of Paras, a small crab-like creature carrying a pair of mushrooms on its back. The mushrooms are parasitic. They are, from the beginning of Paras's life, growing on and through the creature, slowly extending through its body. Paras's eyes are normal. They are animated. They have the look of a creature with an interior life. When Paras evolves into Parasect, the mushroom has grown to cover nearly the entire back. The eyes change. They become blank, white, empty, not animated. The kind of eyes you see in things that are not behind them anymore. Multiple Pokédex entries across different games support the reading that the mushroom has taken control. Parasect is described as being under the complete domination of the mushroom, which extracts nutrients from the host and controls its movements for its own purposes. The host is not dead in the biological sense. The body still moves, still functions, still battles when directed, but the host is gone. What walks around as Parasect is the mushroom's will in a crab-shaped shell. This is, the theory argues, the franchise's quietest horror, the one that doesn't shout or jump or crash the game but simply shows you a creature with empty eyes and lets you understand. There is the Yamask theory, which the Pokédex makes explicit in a way that remains startling no matter how many times you read it. Yamask, introduced in Generation 5, carries a mask. The Pokédex entry for Yamask in black and white reads, "Each of them carries a mask that used to be its face when it was human. Sometimes they look at it and cry. When it was human, this is not metaphor. This is not poetic language. This is the Pokédex, within the narrative fiction of the franchise, stating as fact that Yamask was once a human being, that the mask it carries is a literal portrait of its human face, that the process that transformed it from human to Pokémon left it with just enough memory to look at what it was and mourn it. The implications of this for the broader Pokémon world are considerable. If humans can become Pokémon, if there is some process, some circumstance, some event that can convert a human being into a ghost-type Pokémon, then the line between humans and Pokémon is not the bright, clear line that the franchise usually implies. The two categories bleed into each other. There is traffic between them. Fan theories have connected this to the ancient lore mentioned in Diamond and Pearl about humans and Pokémon once being indistinguishable, once being the same kind of thing, differentiated only by choice of lifestyle. If that ancient unity is real, then Yamask represents the people who went the other direction, who, through death or through some other mechanism, crossed back. There is the Haunter theory, which builds on a specific Pokédex entry that most players overlook because it's buried in the original Red and Blue. Haunter's entry reads, "If you are alone in the dark, it will gently stroke you with its gaseous hand, putting you to sleep forever." Not just to sleep forever. The word forever is in there. Not into an endless sleep as a metaphor for death, but just directly, this Pokémon kills people by putting them to sleep. It is listed among the wild encounters you can find in Pokémon Tower, the Graveyard in Lavender Town. The theorists point out that you cannot interact with the ghosts in Pokémon Tower without the Sylph Scope. The game specifically prevents you from identifying what you're fighting if you don't have the right item. Before you get the Sylph Scope, the encounters are listed only as Ghost Unknown, unidentifiable, something that your character cannot name or understand. The theory says, this is because looking at what you're fighting, acknowledging it as a Haunter or a Ghastly, accepting it into your Pokédex as a known thing is a kind of protection. To name something is to understand it. To understand something is to reduce its power. Without the Sylph Scope, you are alone in the dark with something that has no name, and without a name, it is exactly what Haunter is supposed to be. There is the Ho-Oh and the legendary Beasts theory, which proposes something quietly beautiful about three Pokémon that seem to appear without a prior existence. When Gold and Silver were released, three new legendary Pokémon were introduced: Entei, Raikou, and Suicune. They roam the Johto region. They cannot be reached through normal gameplay, they appear briefly and then run, and tracking them down is one of the first endgame puzzles the franchise ever created. Their origin is given in the games. They were three Pokémon who died in the fire at the Brass Tower, and Ho-Oh resurrected them. The theory, which has circulated for years, and which Game Freak has never officially endorsed or denied, proposes that the three Pokémon who died in the Brass Tower were Jolteon, Flareon, and Vaporeon. The three Eevee evolutions that exist in Generation 1. The evidence: Entei is a fire type, like Flareon. Raikou is an electric type, like Jolteon. Suicune is a water type, like Vaporeon. This would mean that evolutions, killed in a tragic fire, were transformed by Ho-Oh's resurrection power into something different, elevated, mythologized, made legendary. Their types remained, but everything else changed. Their smallness became grandeur, their domesticity became wildness, the pet Pokémon became the sacred beasts. It would also mean that Ho-Oh didn't create them from nothing. It transformed them. It took grief and turned it into something that runs through the world, untouchable and magnificent, never fully at rest. There is the Celebi time loop theory, which involves the events of Pokémon Gold and Silver in a way that most players never fully followed. Celebi is the time travel Pokémon. It can move backward and forward through time. In the Gold and Silver storyline, there is a sequence involving a young man named Silver, who turns out to be the son of Giovanni, the leader of Team Rocket, the franchise's primary villain in Generation 1. Giovanni, by the events of Gold and Silver, has disbanded Team Rocket after his defeat in Red and Blue. He is gone. His son Silver is resentful and aggressive, shaped by growing up as the child of a crime boss who abandoned him. The theory proposes that Celebi was responsible for the events that led to this situation, that a Celebi, traveling through time, influenced the chain of events that led to Giovanni's defeat and Team Rocket's disbandment. Not intentionally, but that its movements through time created ripples. That Silver's existence as a character, his bitterness, his arc of growth, the eventual implied reconciliation with his father, is the result of time being folded back on itself by a creature that was just trying to get from one moment to another. The broader implication is that Celebi's movements throughout Pokémon history are responsible for more than anyone knows. That events which seem to have simple causes have time travel-shaped causes underneath. That the Pokémon world has been touched and altered by its one time traveler in ways that the characters inside it cannot see. There is the red and blue lighthouse theory, which is small and strange and inexplicably affecting. In the games in Cerulean City, there is a house to the east of the gym. Inside the house, a woman is sitting and looking at a picture of a man. She says something to the effect that her husband went out on a trade and never came back. The item she receives is a bicycle voucher, a pass that allows you to get a bicycle from the bike shop in a different town. If you give her the bike voucher as part of the game's item trading chain, she becomes slightly relieved, though her husband is still gone. The puzzle is part of the game's structure, but the woman's loss is never resolved. She sits in her house with her picture and the story moves on. The theory connects this to the Great Pokémon War, suggesting that the woman is one of many in Kanto whose husband left and didn't return, that the bike voucher was the last thing he sent her before whatever happened to him happened. The bicycle chain is the franchise's way of placing a small tragedy inside a mechanic without naming it as such. You feel the loss for a moment and then carry on, and the woman stays in her house and the story moves on. There is the ghost in the old chateau theory, which is from Diamond and Pearl, and which is genuinely eerie even when you know every detail of it. In the Eterna Forest, there is an old mansion called the Old Chateau. It is described as abandoned. The ghost Pokémon that haunt it are Rotom, an electric ghost that can possess electronic appliances. The mansion has an unusual history within the game's lore, vaguely referenced but never made explicit. If you enter specific rooms of the old chateau at night, you encounter sprites that are not Pokémon. An old man sitting in a chair, looking at the player character. A small girl running through the hallway and disappearing. These NPCs cannot be interacted with. They do not respond to the player character. They simply appear and then are gone. They are described, in unofficial analyses and community discussions, as the ghosts of people, actual human ghosts. Not ghost-type Pokémon, but the spirits of the people who used to live in the chateau. This would make them one of the only representations of literal human death in the main series games. Not Pokémon ghosts, not monster ghosts. Human beings who died in that house and remained. The theory builds on this to argue that the chateau's history is darker than the game reveals, that whatever happened there was traumatic enough to leave human spirits behind. The Rotom's presence may be a consequence rather than a cause. The appliance-possessing ghost moved in after the people died. The house has multiple layers of haunting stacked on top of each other, the most recent obscuring the oldest. There is the Drifloon child abduction theory, which requires very little theorizing because the Pokédex does most of the work. Drifloon, the balloon Pokémon of Diamond and Pearl, has a Pokédex entry in Diamond that reads, "It is whispered that any child who mistakes Drifloon for a balloon and holds it by the string will be carried off." This is presented in the game as trivia, as flavor, as the kind of local legend that accumulates around strange Pokémon. But considered without the softening context of the franchise's usual tone, it describes a creature that lures children to their deaths by resembling a toy. It drifts at child height. It is shaped like a balloon that a child would want to pick up. And when a child picks it up, the child disappears. The Pokémon world's most effective predator is not the one with the best battle stats. It is the one that figured out that children will walk right up to it. And then there is the theory about Mewtwo's tears. In the first Pokémon movie, Mewtwo creates a rainstorm so heavy that all the cloned and original Pokémon collapse from exhaustion. The battle ends, not through any trainer's victory, but through sheer physical collapse on both sides. Ash is petrified, turned to stone, briefly, by the crossfire of the clones and originals' attacks. The Pokémon around him begin to cry. Their tears fall on Ash. He revives. The movie tells you that Pokémon tears have the power to revive the dead or the stone dead. It presents this as a deeply emotional and thematically significant moment. What it does not explain is where this power comes from. The theory suggests that all Pokémon tears carry a fragment of Ho-Oh's resurrection power, that Ho-Oh's mythological significance as the bearer of new life is not just its own attribute but something it distributed across Pokémon life generally. That every Pokémon, in the right emotional moment, with the right kind of grief, can access a small portion of what Ho-Oh used to restore the legendary beasts. Under this theory, the reason Ash was revived by Pokémon tears is not because of plot convenience or dramatic necessity. It is because the bond between trainer and Pokémon, at sufficient depth, can call up something ancient and sacred. Something that was always in the Pokémon world, baked into its cosmology, before trainers existed or gyms existed or Pokédexes existed. The power that made the dead legendary beasts run again. The promise that Ho-Oh made to the boy in the storm, closing the world beneath the world. There is a moment, somewhere in every long relationship with Pokémon, where the franchise stops being just a game. It is different for everyone. For some people it happens when they're very young, when a particular piece of music does something inexplicable to their emotional state and they don't have words for why. For others it happens in adolescence, when they're old enough to notice the gaps and the contradictions and the darkness lurking underneath the bright surface. For others, still, it happens in adulthood, when they pick up an old cartridge and find themselves unexpectedly moved by the things they didn't understand when they were small. The conspiracy theories, the fan lore, the community mythology built up across 30 years of collective obsession are how the fandom has tried to articulate this moment. They are the translation of a feeling into a framework. The feeling that Pokémon is bigger than it appears, that it was made by people who were thinking about more than just a game, that somewhere inside the code and the sprites and the music and the Pokédex entries, there is a world with genuine depth, genuine darkness, genuine beauty, and genuine mystery. Most of the theories are wrong in their specifics. Lavender Town didn't kill anyone. Ash is not in a coma. The writers of the anime confirmed he eventually woke up and became champion, and then was retired as a protagonist in 2023. The Great Pokémon War is never fully confirmed, though it's clearly gestured at. Missing No is, at one level, a placeholder in an empty table. But each theory is right about something. Lavender Town is genuinely unsettling, and that unsettlement needed a name. The Pokémon world does have a dark history, and Lieutenant is Surge's one line of dialogue is proof that the writers knew it. Ditto and Mew do share too many traits to be coincidental, and the placement of Ditto in the Pokémon Mansion is not random. The Pokémon world does not add up to itself in the way a straightforward children's franchise would, and that failure to add up is the result of decisions made by designers who were putting more into the world than they were required to. The conspiracy theories are the fandom's way of honoring that intention. They are the community saying, "We saw what you put in there. We noticed. We care. We have spent thousands of hours across decades thinking about a world you built in a tiny laboratory in the mid-1990s, and we are not done yet." Every night, somewhere in the world, someone is lying in the dark replaying this, listening to the music, thinking about the things that don't quite add up, wondering what happened to the missing fathers, wondering what the scientists did with the failed clones, wondering whether the boy in the storm ever woke up, wondering which came first, the ancestor or the god. Pokémon is 30 years old. It has been through 9 generations and dozens of games and 1,000 episodes of anime and a card game and a Go game and movies and manga and every imaginable form of media. And it still has secrets, still has gaps, still has places where the theory lives, where the fan imagination goes to fill in what the official story leaves open. That will not stop. It will never stop. As long as there are people who played these games as children and carried them forward into adulthood, there will be people who look at the world of Pokémon the way you look at a place you know intimately, with the eye of someone who has been there so many times. They can see the things that don't fit, the things that were always there but never named, the shadows at the edge of the route, the music in the empty tower, the child who never ages, the creature that becomes anything because it cannot be itself. We're done for tonight. Let yourself drift. The theories will still be here when you wake up. The mystery is patient. It has been patient for 30 years, and it is in no hurry. Rest well. You've earned it. And if you found something in tonight's journey that stayed with you, something that made you see the franchise differently, something you'll be thinking about tomorrow, leave a comment when you wake up. Tell me which theory got you. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There's more where this came from. Deeper cuts. Stranger corners. More places where the world beneath the world makes itself briefly visible, just at the edge of what we're supposed to see. Good night. End of script. Extended section. The genetic architecture of Mew. Every detail of the clone theory. Let's go back to Cinnabar Island. Let's go back slowly. If you've played the original games, you remember the feeling of arriving there. The island is volcanic dark rock, active smoke, the sense of having traveled somewhere remote and slightly dangerous. The gym is run by Blaine, a fire-type specialist who speaks in riddles and tests your knowledge before the battle. The department store sells items you can't find anywhere else in the region. And there is, at the north end of the island, a building that is not the gym and not the store. A large structure that is clearly designed to have been important once and is now very clearly not okay. The Pokémon Mansion. Inside the Pokémon Mansion, everything is broken. Statues have been knocked over. Doors are sealed by switches that have to be found and pressed. The Pokémon you encounter are unusual coughing and wheezing, Grimer and Muck, and also, in certain versions, Ditto. Moving through the mansion feels less like exploring a building, and more like moving through the aftermath of something. Like arriving at a crime scene after everyone has left. On the floor, on shelves, on tables, there are journals. Not real documents, just a few lines of in-game text, accessed by pressing the button at the right moment. They don't have dates or names. They don't have full context. They are fragments. And what they describe in those fragments is one of the most disturbing research programs in all of Pokémon fiction. Journal entry. We found it. A new species of Pokémon in the jungles of Guyana. Journal entry. This new Pokémon we found is Mew. It is a new species. We named it Mew. Journal entry. Mew gave birth. The Pokémon is Mewtwo. Journal entry. Mewtwo is born. Its power is so overwhelming. We have failed to curb its vicious tendency. Journal entry. Mewtwo destroyed our hideout and escaped. We are unable to stop it. These entries are the skeleton of the story. They don't tell you who wrote them. They don't tell you what the scientists looked like, or what they were hoping to achieve beyond the creation of a powerful Pokémon, or what the months between discovery and disaster actually felt like. They are a bare record of ambition, catastrophe, and flight. But they are enough. They are enough to build on. The detail most theorists fix on is the phrase gave birth. The journal says Mew gave birth to Mewtwo, but biologically, genetically, in every meaningful sense, Mewtwo is a clone of Mew, created in a laboratory through genetic engineering. Mew did not give birth naturally. So why does the journal use that language? One theory says it is the language of someone who spent so long with the project that they began to anthropomorphize it. The scientists became attached to Mew. They watched its behavior. They recorded its preferences and its moods and its responses to stimuli. And when they created the clone from Mew's genetic material, the act of creation felt to the people in that lab, who had been working on this for years, like something that deserved the word birth, like something that required the tenderness of that word, even in a scientific journal, even from people who should have known better. Another theory says the journal's language was deliberate, that Mew was not a passive source of genetic material, but was, in some sense that the scientists could not fully articulate, a participant in what happened. That the creation of Mewtwo was not something done entirely to Mew, but something that Mew, in whatever way a Pokémon experiences these things, allowed to happen. The most extreme version of this theory says that Mew knew what was being done to it and cooperated because it understood something the scientists didn't, that the creation of Mewtwo was necessary. That Mew, which contains the DNA of all Pokémon, and which therefore, under some readings, has some awareness of Pokémon history and future, understood that Mewtwo needed to exist, and it gave what it had to give. This would frame Mewtwo's entire story differently. Not as a tragedy of scientific hubris, but as a story of a mother animal making an impossible sacrifice so that something new could exist in the world. And Mewtwo's fury and violence and need for independence would take on a different quality. The rage of a child who was created for a purpose it did not choose, by a parent who gave everything but could not explain why. Now let's revisit the failed clone angle from a different direction. The scientists on Cinnabar Island were not working alone. The journals reference a team, multiple people involved in the research, and the research was clearly iterative. The creation of Mewtwo did not happen in one attempt. There were failures. There were things that didn't work. The question that the Ditto theory asks is, what happened to the failures? In real-world biology, in the science of cloning, that the Pokémon Mansion clearly gestures at failed clones are not automatically discarded. They are studied. They provide information about what went wrong. A failed attempt at cloning a complex organism produces a result that tells you something about where the process broke down. The most common failures in complex cloning would occur at the point of genetic stability, the point where the cloned genetic material needs to be stable enough to develop into a coherent organism. If the genetic template, Mew's DNA, contains the information for all Pokémon life, then a failed clone would be something that received all of that information but couldn't organize it into a stable, single-species identity. It would be something that has all the genetic information of all Pokémon and can therefore temporarily express any of it, but cannot hold any one expression long enough to become that thing permanently. It would be something that transforms, endlessly, without an identity to return to. This is Ditto. One detail in the theory is rarely discussed but deserves more attention. In Pokémon Gold and Silver, where the breeding mechanic was introduced, Ditto was given a special role. It can breed with almost any Pokémon. The exceptions are legendary Pokémon, Pokémon from the no-gender egg group, and Pokémon that cannot breed at all. Almost everything else can produce an egg with Ditto. This is described in the games as a function of Ditto's unique ability to match itself to any partner. But the mechanics of Pokémon breeding are, within the fiction, not purely a game system, they represent actual biological reproduction. If Ditto can produce offspring with almost any Pokémon species, it means Ditto's genetic architecture is compatible with every Pokémon genome, which is exactly what you would expect from a failed clone of Mew. Mew's genome is compatible with all Pokémon because it contains all Pokémon DNA. A failed clone of Mew, something that received the full template but couldn't organize it, would inherit this compatibility. It would be genetically interoperable with any Pokémon species, not because it chose to be, but because it carries the foundational code from which all species descended. Ditto's breeding ability is not a quirk or a gameplay convenience. It is the most direct evidence in the games that Ditto shares genetic architecture with the ancestor of all Pokémon. It is Mew's universality, expressed in the only way that remains available to something that never fully became Mew. Extended section. The War's Children. Deepening the Kanto conflict theory. The Great Pokémon War theory becomes more interesting the further you look for its echoes. Consider the gym system. Gyms in Kanto are not merely sporting venues. They are civic institutions buildings in every major town, maintained by a trainer who is powerful enough to hold the position, with formal rules governing who can challenge them and how. They issue badges that confer formal recognition of a trainer's skill. 8 badges allow entry to the Pokémon League, the governing body of competitive training. This is a highly formalized system. It is organized. It has hierarchy. It has credentialing processes. It exists in every town, even small ones. Even Pewter City, which has more fossils than citizens, has a gym. Even Viridian City, where Professor Oak's laboratory and Pallet Town's entire regional significance is concentrated, has a gym. Why does every town have a gym? In a peaceful society organized around Pokémon battling as sport, you might expect major population centers to have gyms. You would not necessarily expect every small town to have one. But if you were a society that had just emerged from a conflict in which trained Pokémon teams were used militarily, you would understand the strategic value of maintaining a culture of Pokémon training at every level of the population. You would want every town to have an institution that trained and certified battlers, because you might need them again. The gym system, under this reading, is not purely a sporting institution. It is dual-use infrastructure. It keeps the population battle-ready in a way that the society has chosen to frame as competition, as sport, as the harmless deployment of the skills that were once used for something much less harmless. Lieutenant Surge is not the only character in Kanto who implies a military background. The sailors in Vermilion City, the ones who crew and service the SS Anne, talk about the port in ways that suggest a history of military naval operations. The SS Anne itself, a luxury liner, operates from what is clearly a significant harbor installation. The infrastructure around the port is more robust than you'd expect for a region primarily served by a single boat. The guard in the gatehouse between routes, the NPCs who sit in the small buildings between areas and occasionally block your path until you perform some task are uniformed. They have a formal appearance. Their role, ostensibly, is civilian road management. But their design and their positioning controlling access between zones, stationed at every boundary, maps quite cleanly onto military checkpoint culture. None of this is conclusive. Design choices are often made for aesthetic reasons, or for gameplay convenience, or because the designers were drawing on familiar visual language without intending specific thematic implications. But taken together, across the whole map of Kanto, there is a consistent visual grammar of defensive architecture, controlled movement, and institutional battling culture that fits the post-war hypothesis more cleanly than it fits the alternative, a society that has simply always been this way, for no particular reason. The theory has one more dimension that is worth dwelling on, because it concerns a character who is easy to overlook. Professor Oak is the most powerful figure in the Kanto narrative. He is the one who gives you the Pokédex. He is the one who sets the goal: catch all the Pokémon, complete the research. He is the grandfather of your rival and the preeminent scientific authority of the region. He is benevolent and wise, and he sends you out into the world with tools and purpose. But consider what he doesn't do. He doesn't know where your father is. The topic is not raised. He doesn't explain the absence of adult men in the region. The topic is not raised. He doesn't explain how a region organized around Pokémon battling came to be a region organized around Pokémon battling. The topic is not raised. Oak is old enough to have been an adult during the war. If the war happened, if there was a conflict significant enough to reshape the demographics of the region, to leave Lieutenant Surge with battlefield trauma, to leave an entire generation of children without fathers, Oak was there. He survived it. He is, by the events of Red and Blue, one of the men who made it through. The theory asks, why doesn't he talk about it? One answer is that people who survive terrible things often choose not to discuss them with the children around them, especially children they are trying to give hope to. Oak's entire project, the Pokédex, the research, the journey he sends you on can be read as an attempt to create a future that is not haunted by the past. He sends a child out to document the world not because the documentation is urgent, but because the journey is necessary. Because children need to move through the world with wonder rather than with the weight of history. He knows what happened. He chooses to give you the Pokédex instead. Extended section, the living code deeper into Missing No, and the architecture of absence. The thing that makes Missing No so enduring is not what it does to your game. It is what it does to your imagination. Every glitch at some level is a window. When a system breaks down, when it encounters data it wasn't designed to handle, or accesses memory it wasn't supposed to access, or runs a process that its creators never tested, the result reveals something about the system's architecture that normal operation conceals. The break is also the revelation. Missing No broke the architecture of Generation 1 in a way that revealed to a generation of children who didn't have the vocabulary to describe what they were seeing, that the game was a construction, that it was built, piece by piece, by human beings who made decisions and left things behind and didn't finish everything they started. The cartridge was not a sealed world. It had seams. And through the seams, if you knew exactly where to press, you could see the scaffolding. The most significant revelation of the 2020 source code leak, significant for the fan theory community anyway, if not for professional researchers, was the confirmation that the Missing No slots in the game's index table were occupied in early development by real Pokémon sprites. Some of these sprites had been glimpsed before, in bio-illustrations of Satoshi Tajiri that depicted scrapped creatures from the development process. Some were completely new. Several appeared to be early design iterations of Pokémon that would eventually appear in later generations, the original concepts for creatures that weren't finished in time for Generation 1, that were moved to the sequel games, but whose placeholder data remained in the original code even after they had been removed. This confirms something that the theorists had always maintained. Missing No is not one thing. It is a category. It is the name the game gives to all the creatures it expected to have but doesn't. The name is, in the Japanese original, Ketsuban Missing Number. It is a label for an absence, a placeholder for something that was supposed to be there and isn't. The community's imagination has always been excited by this because it implies that the Pokémon world, the world of the game, is not the full extent of the Pokémon world. That there are creatures that didn't make it, that exist in the design history but not in the game, that were assigned numbers and names and positions in the story and then removed. And the removed things don't entirely go away. They leave a shape where they were, a numbered absence, a cry without a face. There is one specific theory about Missing No that goes further than any other, and that, if true, would be the most remarkable piece of intentional design in the entire franchise. It suggests that Missing No is God, not in the Arceus sense, in the sense of the one thing that was always there before everything else, the zero before the one. In computer systems, zero is not nothing, it is the value that precedes all other values. The index slot 000, which Missing No occupies in the game's internal table, is before everything else, before Bulbasaur's slot 001, before everything. And Missing No, in slot 000, is listed as having a Pokédex comment of under construction. The creators note to themselves, the placeholder that acknowledges that this slot has not been filled, that this position in the world is not yet occupied by anything finished. The theory says, what if Missing No was always meant to be Mew? Not the Mew that eventually appeared in the game at slot 151, but an original Mew, the ancestor, the zero, the one that comes before counting begins. The creature that the designers were always going to put in slot 000 as the primordial Pokémon, the one that all others descended from, but that never got finished in time, and was moved to the end of the list and eventually given to employees at Nintendo as a secret. Under this theory, Missing No. Sea chaos is not the chaos of an error. It is the chaos of the original, of the thing that was everything before anything was organized. It is what the world looks like before the structure that makes it comprehensible is imposed. It is the deep code, the foundation, visible only when you know exactly which tile to stand on and which direction to surf. It is the ancestor, extended section, the psyche map, what Ash's dream tells us about his inner life. We spent time earlier establishing the basic structure of the coma theory. Now let's go deeper into the specifics, into the individual characters, and what they might represent within the framework of Ash's dreaming mind. The original version of the theory was remarkable for its psychological specificity. It didn't just say that the characters were figments of Ash's imagination. It proposed that each major character represented a specific psychological function, a part of Ash's inner life, that needed to be worked through during the long journey of the coma dream. Misty, in this reading, represents Ash's first love, the awakening of romantic feeling, the confusion of early attraction, the complicated way that care and irritation coexist in young relationships. This is why their relationship is characterized by the exact emotional language of first love, the bickering that is also tenderness, the way she never quite says what she means, the way he never quite understands what she's saying. The dream generates her because Ash, at 10 years old, was just beginning to encounter these feelings and they needed somewhere to go. Brock represents the longing for an older male role model. Ash doesn't have a father, he doesn't have a big brother, he doesn't have a mentor in the conventional sense. Professor Oak is there, but he's old, a grandfather figure rather than an older brother figure. Brock fills the gap. He cooks. He takes care of the team. He maintains the practical side of the journey while Ash provides the forward momentum. He represents what Ash wishes a paternal figure looked like, someone capable and nurturing and present. Brock's comedy, the theory notes, is always about longing, specifically the longing for connection with women that always fails. This reflects Ash's own unexpressed longing for connection and belonging, displaced into a comedic register because the dreaming mind is protecting him from feeling it directly. Team Rocket, Jesse, James, and Meowth are the theory's most interesting psychological objects. The original version of the theory proposed that they represent Ash's shadow self, the negative qualities he recognizes in himself that he has not yet integrated. His selfishness, his laziness, his desire to take shortcuts, his occasional willingness to lie. These qualities cannot simply be removed from the personality of a 10-year-old boy. They have to be encountered, battled, and ultimately outlasted. Team Rocket's consistent failure, their inability to win, their perpetual return, their transformation from genuinely threatening to comedic represents the gradual taming of Ash's shadow self. By the time they're comedy figures rather than threats, he's integrated what they represent. He no longer needs them to be scary. This is also why Team Rocket became less menacing in direct proportion to the medicated stabilization of the coma dream in the more medical version of the theory. Not just narrative convenience, but psychological process. The threat diminishes as the boy grows. The Pokémon themselves, Ash's Pokémon, specifically represent relationships and attachments and emotional lessons. Pikachu is the most obvious, the relationship that required the most work, that started with the most resistance, and that became the most foundational. The bond with Pikachu represents Ash's primary attachment, the template for all subsequent relationships. Getting Pikachu to trust him is the first and most important emotional task of the dream. Charizard, who was disobedient for years before eventually respecting Ash, represents the boy's relationship with his own strength and power. The parts of himself that he couldn't control. The aspects of his capability that were too large and too fierce to be easily managed. Charizard's arc, eventual earned respect, eventual willingness to listen, is the arc of a child learning to take ownership of his own most powerful traits without being overwhelmed by them. Butterfree, who left, represents first loss, the understanding that connections do not always last, that the people and things you love most will sometimes have their own trajectories that don't include you. The farewell to Butterfree is the dream's first teaching about impermanence. And Pikachu's resistance to evolving his refusal of the Thunderstone in the episode where Ash offers it to him is the dream's way of saying that the most important things in life are not made better by becoming something else. Pikachu, staying as Pikachu, is the constant. The thing that does not change in a world of constant change. The regions Ash travels to in the dream are each distinct emotional territories. Kanto is childhood pure, uncomplicated, the feeling of first beginning. The rules are clear, the challenges are defined, the goal is stated at the outset. It is the region of initial optimism, before any significant loss has had time to accumulate. Johto is the first complication, a region that looks and feels like Kanto but isn't quite, the familiar made slightly foreign. This is the dream working through the experience of growing up and realizing that the world is bigger and stranger than the childhood version of yourself understood. Ash returns to familiar structures, gyms, Pokémon centers, the format of the journey, but finds them in a new context and has to relearn everything slightly. Hoenn is the first true reinvention. New companions, new setting, deeper mythology. The dream is pushing into territory that the earlier narrative hadn't explored. This is where the coma becomes truly elaborated, where the dreaming mind has settled in enough to begin generating fully realized new places rather than variations on the first. And so on. Through each region, each one a different psychological territory. Each one the dream expanding to fill in a new part of the emotional landscape that a 10-year-old boy, frozen in the moment before beginning, needed to work through. The coma theory received an interesting coda with the actual conclusion of Ash's story in the anime in 2023. In the real world, the creative team finally wrote Ash as champion. He won the World Coronation Series and became the best trainer in the world. And then the anime retired him as the protagonist, passing the lead to new characters, new regions, a fresh start. Ash's story was completed. He finally became what he always said he wanted to be. Within the coma theory's framework, this is the moment of waking up. The dream was always supposed to end with Ash achieving his goal because the goal was the condition that would allow him to rest. A dreaming mind that sets itself an impossible task become the very best needs to achieve that task before it can release itself. Once achieved, the dream ends. The boy wakes up. He is presumably no longer 10 years old. He has been in a coma for a very long time, real-world time. But in the dream, he accomplished everything he set out to do. He became champion. He woke up. Or maybe, and this is the coma theory's most melancholy possible ending, maybe becoming champion was just the dream completing itself. and the boy in the bed never woke up at all, and the champion who looked out at the world from the top of the World Coronation Series podium was still, and always will be, the same 10-year-old who fell in a storm beside a borrowed bicycle, in a life that was, from that moment forward, entirely his imagination. Extended section: The Silence of the Fathers and the Shape of Loss. Let's stay with the war theory a little longer, because there is a specific kind of grief that it names, and it deserves to be named carefully. The absence of fathers in the Pokémon world is not just a design shorthand, or a genre convention, or a way to give the protagonist independence of movement without parental oversight. It is too consistent to be accidental. It appears across multiple mainline games, across the anime, across the side games. It is structural. It is the shape of something that was decided. Your character in Red and Blue has a father who is never mentioned. Your character in Gold and Silver has a father, Norman, who is living in a different region entirely. In Hoenn, as a gym leader, he is present in the world but absent from your life. When you meet him eventually in Ruby and Sapphire, the relationship is complicated. He is the gym leader you have to defeat to progress. The one person who should simply be your father is also an obstacle in your path. The game makes you battle him. Your character in Diamond and Pearl has a father who is also absent, also a gym leader, Volkner, in some fan theories, though this is never officially confirmed. Ash's father in the anime is mentioned exactly once, obliquely, by Ash's mother, and his identity and whereabouts have never been revealed in 30 years of broadcast. The missing father is not a mistake. The missing father is a recurring presence precisely through its absence. The war theory gives this a historical explanation, but there is another reading, one that runs parallel to the war theory rather than competing with it. Pokémon, as a franchise, was created by Satoshi Tajiri. Tajiri's relationship with his own father was complicated. He grew up as someone who was deeply passionate about collecting bugs and exploring the natural world around his home in Machida, a suburb of Tokyo that was rapidly being developed and paved over during his childhood. His father wanted him to pursue a more conventional path. The tension between the child's love of wild things and the adult world's demand for conformity and purpose is one of the emotional foundations of Pokémon as a concept. The idea of a child setting out alone, without parents, into a world of wild creatures to catch and catalog and befriend this is a fantasy rooted in Tajiri's own childhood. The mother who stays at home and trusts you to be okay. The father who is simply not there. This arrangement, in the game, gives the player the freedom to do what Tajiri wished he could do, to simply go, to discover, to fill the notebook with everything the world had to offer. Under this reading, the absent fathers in Pokémon are not casualties of an in-fiction war. They are the shape of Tajiri's own experience, the creative decision of a designer who understood what it felt like to want more freedom than parental presence allows, and who built a world where that freedom was structurally guaranteed from the first page. Both readings can be true simultaneously. A work of art is allowed to mean multiple things. The absent fathers can be the war's dead, and also the creator's wish. The world of Pokémon can be a post-conflict landscape, and also a child's dream of independence. These are not mutually exclusive. They are, in fact, the same emotional note played in two different registers. Extended section: The Moon and the Mirror. More on Gengar and the philosophy of shadow. We talked about Gengar and Clefable earlier, but there is a philosophical dimension to the shadow theory that deserves its own space. The idea of the shadow in its psychological and philosophical usage is not simply the dark version of something. In Jungian psychology, which some fans have brought to bear on Pokémon theory, the shadow is the part of the self that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. The traits that the person has, but does not want to claim. The darkness that exists in every person, every system, every apparently benign thing. Clefable is one of the most consistently presented as friendly, shy, and gentle. Its Pokédex entries describe it as a timid creature that hides in the mountains, descending only rarely, that runs from humans if spotted. It is presented as innocent, harmless, a creature of moonlight and quiet places. And Gengar is Clefable's shadow. Not in the sense that Gengar is evil. Gengar is mischievous, prankish, occasionally dangerous, but not evil in the way that Pokémon villains are evil. What Gengar represents, in the shadow reading, is everything that Clefable does not present. Where Clefable hides from humans, Gengar seeks them out. Where Clefable is gentle, Gengar is aggressive. Where Clefable stands in moonlight, Gengar lives in the dark that moonlight creates. The shadow is not the opposite of the self. It is the complement. The part that the self denies, that exists in spite of the denial, that expresses itself anyway in the places the self cannot see. Clefable cannot see its shadow. It never looks. It is too busy hiding, being gentle, being safe in its mountain. And behind it, always, Gengar laughs. The Valentine's Day image that the official Pokémon account posted Gengar and Clefable holding hands is significant within this reading because of what holding hands means to a shadow. A shadow doesn't touch. A shadow is cast behind you. It doesn't reach forward. It doesn't make contact with anything. If Gengar is Clefable's shadow, then Gengar holding hands with Clefable is a moment of integration, the moment when the shadow is acknowledged, is faced, is accepted rather than denied. The moment when the person turns around and looks at what has been following them all along, and instead of running, reaches out their hand. This is the psychological resolution of the shadow, not the elimination of it, not the victory of the light over the dark, but the integration of both into a coherent whole. Clefable and Gengar, holding hands, are not opposites in conflict. They are the same thing, finally facing each other. Game Freak posted that image on Valentine's Day. The day of love. Of the heart facing what it feels. Extended section. The sound of the world. What music tells us about the Pokémon world's hidden history. Before we return to the closing, let's do something we haven't done yet. Let's talk about the music. Not Lavender Town, we covered that. Let's talk about the other pieces of music that the theorists have flagged over the decades as revealing something about the world they inhabit. The music of Pokémon Red and Blue was composed by Junichi Masuda, who would later become a major figure in Game Freak's creative leadership. The limitations he was working under were extreme. The Game Boy sound chip gave him 4 channels and a very limited range of tones. Within those constraints, he produced something remarkable. The music of Generation 1 is immediately recognizable, immediately emotionally resonant, and in several cases, specifically in the pieces associated with Pokémon Tower and the Cinnabar Island area, genuinely haunting. The Pokémon Tower theme is different from the Lavender Town theme. It has a slower, more deliberate quality. Where the Lavender Town theme cycles and unresolved, the Pokémon Tower theme feels like descending. Like going deeper into something, the tones move downward. The melody droops. It is the sound of grief organized into a walking pace. The theory around the Pokémon Tower theme is that it was composed with specific emotional intent, that Masuda, knowing what the tower represented, a cemetery, a haunting, a story about a dead mother and her grieving child, constructed the music to embody the act of paying respects. The tempo corresponds to a slow walk through a graveyard. The falling melody corresponds to the physical act of bowing your head. It is mourning music, designed by someone who understood what mourning sounds and feels like. The music of Mount Moon is the counterpoint to this. Mount Moon is the first cave in the game, dark, confusing, full of Pokémon you weren't expecting, and also full of history. Fossil Pokémon are found there. The Clefairy dance in the deepest part of the mountain under the full moon. It is a location that the game signals as significant and ancient. The Mount Moon theme has a different quality from the dungeon music in many other games of the era. It is mysterious rather than tense. It is curious rather than threatening. It suggests a place that has been there much longer than anyone who currently walks through it. A place with a history that predates trainers and gyms and Pokeballs and everything that the human world has layered on top of the wild world. The theory around Mount Moon's music is that it was designed to evoke the world before humanity's presence, the world of the Pokémon themselves, before the invention of the Pokeball, before the establishment of the League, before the war. The Clefairy that dance in Mount Moon are, according to their Pokédex entries, performing a ritual dance around a moonstone. They do this regardless of whether any human is watching. They did this before humans were watching. They will do it after. Mount Moon's music is the sound of something that doesn't need you. That was here before you and will be here after. That is indifferent to your presence in the best possible sense, not hostile, not cruel, just simply continuing its own existence, as it always has, in the dark, deep places of the mountain. The music of the endgame, the Pokémon League, the Champions theme, the Hall of Fame has always been read by the theorists as evidence of the war's presence in the culture. It is grand. It is martial. It has the quality of military ceremony filtered through sport. The drums in the background are parade drums. The triumphal quality of the melody is the quality of a victory parade, not a sporting event, but a homecoming. In a world that had experienced a war, the championship of the Pokémon League would be the highest cultural expression of the battling tradition that sustained the society through its worst moment. The music of the championship is the music of the survivors, the people who made it through something terrible and built this. A formalized competition, a way to honor the skills that kept them alive by transforming them into achievement rather than violence. The Hall of Fame, where your team's record is kept, is not just a score table, it is a memorial. It remembers your champions. It preserves them. In a culture shaped by the loss of people who should have been remembered, the Hall of Fame is a small act of permanence in a world that was shaped by impermanence. When you sit in the silence after the credits of Pokémon Red and Blue, in the quiet moment between the last note of the Hall of Fame music and the return to the title screen, you are sitting in the silence of a world that has something behind it. Something you won't find if you only play the game. Something that requires you to listen carefully, to look at the gaps, to wonder about the fathers and the empty building and the soldier in the military fatigues who survived a war that no one talks about. The silence is part of the score. The gaps are part of the map. The missing numbers are part of the world. This is what the theorists have always known. The world of Pokémon is big enough to contain all the theories at once. Big enough to be a children's game and a war narrative and a grief mythology and a creation story and a dream of a boy who never woke up and an ecological warning and a meditation on identity and loss. It is big enough to hold Ditto's tragedy and Cubone's grief and Gengar's darkness and missing No's ghost shape and Arceus's paradox and N's hidden nature and Ash's eternal 10-year-old hope. It always has been. That's why we're still here. That's why we're still talking about it. In the dark. Long after we should have gone to sleep. End of extended script. If you made it all the way here, if this found you at the end of a long day or in the quiet of a sleepless night or in some in-between hour when the world has gone quiet and you needed somewhere to rest your mind, thank you for being here. Drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Tell me which theory kept you up or settled you down. Tell me which one you already knew and which one you'd never heard before tonight. And subscribe if you want more. There's more where this came from. More worlds with more layers. More places where the light falls at exactly the right angle to show you what's underneath. Good night. Final extended section. The 1,000 small theories, everything else the community never stopped talking about. There are theories in the Pokémon community that don't make every major list. They don't have formal names. They circulate in forum threads and Reddit posts, and the particular kind of late-night conversation that happens between people who have been fans long enough to start finding the edges of the canon and wondering what's on the other side. These theories are smaller, stranger, and in some cases more haunting than the big ones. Let's go through the ones that have stayed in the collective imagination the longest. There is the theory about Spiritomb. Spiritomb is a Pokémon from Diamond and Pearl whose design is already exceptional, a swirling vortex of ghostly faces contained within a small stone called an odd keystone. Its Pokédex entry states it was formed by the binding of 108 spirits, and that it was imprisoned in the odd keystone as punishment for misdeeds 500 years ago. The binding of 108 spirits is a specific number, with specific cultural resonance in Japanese Buddhism. 108 is the number of earthly temptations or human desires, and bells in Buddhist temples are struck 108 times on New Year's Eve to drive out these desires. The theory is that the 108 spirits in Spiritomb are not random souls. They are human souls. Specifically, they are the souls of 108 people who committed the misdeeds the Pokédex references, people who were judged, sentenced, and merged together in the keystone as a collective punishment. Their faces are visible in Spiritomb's design, swirling eternally, unable to escape. This means that Spiritomb is not just a Pokémon. It is a prison. A living, mobile, battling prison containing the compressed remnants of over 100 human beings. And you put it in your party. There is the theory about Alakazam's memory and what it implies about Pokémon consciousness. Alakazam's Pokédex entry, across multiple games, states that its brain possesses an IQ of approximately 5,000. It is said to memorize everything it has ever experienced. It has a phenomenal memory capacity that far exceeds any human being. It does not forget. It cannot forget. The theory asks, what does it mean for a Pokémon to live a life of total recall? Alakazam remembers every battle it has ever been in, every time it was defeated, every time it was hurt, every time a trainer's bad strategy put it in a situation it couldn't win. Every time it was traded away, stored in a PC box, released. It remembers all of it with perfect clarity, experiences every memory with full emotional vividness, and cannot choose to forget or diminish or soften any of it. The trainer who catches an Alakazam is not catching a creature that will form a bond with them through shared experience, through the accumulation of memories that deepen into something meaningful. They are catching a creature that was already, before they ever met it, a fully formed individual with a complete history of experiences, joys, fears, and traumas, every one of which it carries forward into its life with you, with total and permanent clarity. Alakazam is the most conscious Pokémon in the Pokédex, in any meaningful neurological sense, and it knows everything that has ever happened to it, and it cannot stop knowing. There is the theory about the evolution stones and what they might represent in terms of the Pokémon world's deeper biology. Evolution stones, Firestone, Waterstone, Thunderstone, Leafstone, and so on are items that, when used on specific Pokémon, cause them to evolve. The evolution is permanent and immediate. There is no leveling up, no specific move learned, no friendship milestone reached. The stone is applied, and the Pokémon transforms. In the games, stones are treated as simple items. You buy them or find them. They have a clear mechanical function. But the theorists have long been interested in what stones actually are within the fiction of the Pokémon world, what they're made of, where they come from, and why they have the specific effects they do. The most developed version of the theory draws on the lore from Diamond and Pearl about the creation of the Pokémon world. Arceus created the world from nothing, using its 1,000 arms, and in doing so, shaped the physical matter of the Pokémon world. The theory proposes that evolution stones are pieces of the original creation fragments of the primordial material that Arceus shaped, which retain the creative energy of the original act. When a Firestone is used on Vulpix, it is not introducing new material into the Pokémon's biology. It is introducing a fragment of the original creative force, the force that shaped all Pokémon life, and allowing that force to accelerate the Pokémon's development in a specific direction. This would explain why stones work on some Pokémon but not others, and why different stones produce different results. The creative energy of a fire-attuned fragment is compatible with fire-type Pokémon biology in a way that allows it to catalyze their development. The thunder-attuned fragment is compatible with electric-type biology. The stone and the Pokémon resonate, and the resonance produces transformation. Under this reading, every time a trainer uses an evolution stone, they are engaging with a piece of the original creative act of the Pokémon universe. They are, in a small way, participating in creation. Not creating something new, catalyzing something that was already latent in the Pokémon, already potential, waiting for the right application of the right creative force. There is the theory about the Magikarp to Gyarados evolution and what it says about the Pokémon world's relationship with mythology and time. Gyarados' design is explicitly based on the Chinese legend of the Dragon Gate, the story of a carp that swims upstream, overcomes enormous obstacles, leaps over the Dragon Gate waterfall, and is transformed into a dragon. This legend is well documented, and Game Freak has acknowledged the connection. It is one of the clearest cases of direct mythological sourcing in the franchise. But the theory notes something interesting about this choice. The legend of the Dragon Gate is not just a story about transformation. It is a story about worthiness, about the idea that transformation must be earned, that the process of earning it matters as much as the transformation itself. The carp that makes it over the waterfall becomes a dragon not because it was ever secretly a dragon, but because it did something genuinely difficult that revealed what it was capable of. Magikarp in the games is famously useless. It knows Splash, which does nothing. It has the worst stats of any Pokémon except for certain special cases. It appears weak and helpless and pointless. And then, at level 20, it evolves into Gyarados, one of the most powerful non-legendary Pokémon in the game, with terrifying stats and a presence that makes clear it was never the joke it appeared to be. The theory says this transformation is not just a clever gameplay design choice. It is a statement about potential, about the idea that something can appear to be nothing, and contain within it the capacity for something enormous. The Pokémon world, which is built around training and growth and the development of potential through effort and relationship, is making an argument about the nature of potential itself. It is not visible from the outside. It is not obvious. A Magikarp looks hopeless. A Magikarp contains Gyarados. And the specific level at which the transformation happens Level 20, not level 50, not level 100, suggests that the transformation doesn't require infinite effort. It requires enough effort. The carp doesn't have to climb the waterfall infinite times. Just once. Just enough to prove what it has in it. There is the theory about Porygon's exile from the anime and what it says about the franchise's relationship with its own mistakes. Porygon is a digital Pokémon, the first artificial Pokémon, created through computer programming rather than biological processes. It is not a living organism in the conventional sense. It is code that has achieved the complexity and stability of a creature. It was designed to operate in cyberspace, to navigate digital environments, to function in virtual reality. In 1997, the Pokémon anime broadcast an episode called Electric Soldier Porygon, in which Ash and his team entered a computer network using a virtual reality system, accompanied by Porygon. During the episode, a sequence of rapidly alternating red and blue flashing lights, created by Pikachu's lightning bolt, caused seizures in hundreds of Japanese children watching the broadcast. The episode was pulled. It has never been rebroadcast. It has never been officially released outside Japan. In the aftermath, Porygon and its evolutions Porygon 2 and Porygon Z have effectively never appeared in the anime as active characters since. They are not banned in the games. They can be caught, trained, battled with, used in competitive play. But in the anime, the medium that reaches the widest audience and shapes the broadest perception of the franchise's characters, they are absent. The cause of the seizure-inducing flash was, as established in post-broadcast analysis, Pikachu's attack, not Porygon. Pikachu was the source of the specific animation that caused the harm, and yet Pikachu remains the franchise mascot, present in every episode, unchanged. Porygon disappeared. The theory about this situation is not that Game Freak made this decision consciously or cynically, that they knew Pikachu was responsible and chose to blame Porygon to protect the mascot. The theory is more interesting than that. The theory says that the Pokémon Company, in making this decision, demonstrated something true about how systems work, how blame gets assigned not according to factual responsibility, but according to who can most easily be made the symbol of the problem without damaging the larger structure. Porygon could be erased from the anime without consequence to the franchise. Pikachu could not be erased without destroying the franchise. And so the thing that was expendable took the blame for the thing that was not, and the two creatures have lived very different existences ever since. The theorists find this a more human story than a corporate one. It is not unique to Pokémon. It is the story of how any institution handles a crisis by finding the element that can bear the weight of consequence without bringing the whole structure down. It is pragmatic and it is unjust, and it happens everywhere all the time. Poor Porygon. It did nothing wrong. It has had 30 years to think about it. There is the theory about the Pokémon world's relationship with death more broadly, not just the specific dead Pokémon and human spirits we've discussed, but the general treatment of death as a concept across the franchise. In the mainline games, Pokémon never die in battle. They faint, they lose consciousness. They are taken to the Pokémon Center and revived, fully healed, with no lasting physical damage. The franchise made a very deliberate choice about this. The choice to represent battle consequences as fainting rather than death was not just a ratings-friendly decision, though it was that too. It was a fundamental design choice about what kind of world this is. A world where creatures cannot die in battle is a world with a different relationship to violence than our own. The battles are real, the pain is real. The Pokédex entries make clear that attacks genuinely hurt, that burns and paralysis and freezing, and the rest are genuine physical experiences for the Pokémon. But the consequence of losing is rest, not death. Recovery, not end. This is a fantasy about what conflict could be like, about what it would mean if you could commit fully to the struggle without the worst possible outcome, about what happens to violence when it is stripped of its ultimate consequence and becomes something more like sport and less like war. And then you have the Lavender Town Cemetery, the Mother Marowak who is dead and haunts the tower, the Cubone who carries the skull, the Gengar who is a dead thing, the Yamask who is human, the Spiritomb that is imprisonment, the old chateau ghosts. Death exists in the Pokémon world. It just doesn't happen during the game you're playing. It happened before. It happened in the spaces between what you're shown. It is everywhere in the backstory, in the mythology, in the design of creatures who carry their grief and their loss into the present. The Pokémon world is a world where death is real, but where you cannot make it happen by playing. The violence you can commit is safe violence. But the violence that was committed before you arrived, the mother killed by Team Rocket, the people imprisoned in the Keystone, the dead who became Yamask, that violence is permanent and irreversible and present. This is, the theory argues, the most honest thing the franchise does. It acknowledges that violence has permanent consequences. It just places those consequences in the past, in the lore, in the backstory, and asks you to encounter them, to think about them, to mourn them, in the middle of your cheerful adventure through the tall grass. You cannot kill anything in these games, but you are surrounded by things that have been killed, and they are trying to tell you something. There is the theory about what Pokémon breeding means within the Pokémon world's fiction, and it is the theory that perhaps most clearly demonstrates how the franchise's game systems, when interpreted literally within the fiction, become much more troubling than they appear when treated as abstract mechanics. In the games, Pokémon can be left at the daycare, or in later games, the nursery where they are looked after by staff while the trainer is away. If two Pokémon of compatible species and egg groups are left together, they may produce an egg. The trainer returns, receives the egg, hatches it, and has a baby Pokémon. The game presents this as a simple mechanic. You want a specific Pokémon with specific moves or stats or nature? Find the right parent combination, leave them at the daycare, come back later, straightforward. But consider what this looks like from inside the fiction. A trainer leaves two Pokémon with strangers. The Pokémon have no say in the arrangement. They are not consulted, they cannot refuse, they are simply placed in an enclosure together. Some time passes. An egg appears. The trainer returns, takes the egg, leaves the parents behind, and hatches the egg elsewhere. The offspring will likely never meet its parents. It will be trained by whoever hatched it, toward whatever purpose the trainer had in mind. This is, within the fiction, not an abstract mechanic. It is the organization of Pokémon reproduction for the trainer's benefit. The Pokémon involved don't make the choice. They're left at the daycare and something happens while they're there. The theory doesn't suggest the franchise is endorsing anything problematic by including this mechanic. It suggests that the mechanic, taken seriously as something that happens within a fictional world where Pokémon have interior lives and feelings and preferences and relationships, is evidence that the relationship between trainers and Pokémon is not as egalitarian as the franchise usually presents it. That there is a power dynamic built into the structure of the world that the cheerful surface does not acknowledge. Generation 5's Team Plasma built their whole ideology on this observation. N's argument that Pokémon should be free of trainers, that the relationship is inherently exploitative, is not presented as simply wrong. It is presented as an idea that the player must grapple with. Game Freak chose to make the villains of Black and White the ones who articulate a genuinely challenging moral position, one that the player's own actions throughout the game, catching, training, breeding, battling, are complicit in. And then they let the player decide whether to agree. There is, finally, the oldest theory of all, the one that predates the internet, the one that lived in playgrounds and schoolyards and was passed in whispers from one child to another. There is a Mew under the truck in Vermilion City. There is no Mew under the truck. There never was. The truck, which sits near the water at Vermilion City's dock, can be moved in the game by using strength and HM that allows you to push large boulders and, apparently, trucks, and there is nothing under it, just empty tile. But the rumor persisted for years. Through the entire first generation of the games, through the period before internet guides made the truth easily accessible, children told other children that if you used strength on the truck at the right moment, if you had all the right items, if you had talked to all the right NPCs, Mew was there. The rumor was wrong. But the Mew that was actually in the game, the Mew hidden in the code, accessible only through specific glitches that manipulated the game's memory and triggered encounters from data that wasn't supposed to be loaded, was real. There was a Mew in the game. There has always been a Mew in the game. It was just never where anyone expected to find it. In Pokémon Sun and Moon, released in 2016, a truck appears near a harbor. There is nothing under it. The game's designers put it there specifically as an acknowledgement of the old rumor, a knowing wink across 20 years to the children who believed in something that wasn't there. Except, as the theorists immediately pointed out, what is the truck doing there at all? Why include it if not to remind you? Why remind you if not to tell you something? What is the game saying, putting that truck back in the world, in a different harbor, in a different region, 20 years later? Maybe it's just a joke, a fond callback, a piece of nostalgia from designers who were children when the rumor circulated. Or maybe it's the franchise's acknowledgement of something it has always known, that the most interesting thing about Pokémon has never been what's officially in the game. It's been what the fans believed was in the game. It's been the Mew under the truck, the Lavender Town syndrome, the missing numbers, the boy who never woke up. The belief was always more interesting than the debunking. The myth was always bigger than the game. That's why we're still here. Still looking. Still listening to the music in the empty town and wondering what it's hiding. Close your eyes. Let the world get quiet. The theories will still be here tomorrow. Patient as always, waiting for the next person who stays up a little too late and starts to wonder what they might have missed. Good night, and thank you for being here.